Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. At Carlisle's suggestion, the four of us took off into the trees. Carlisle, Asme, Rosie, and Jasper stayed with Laurent to keep his attention away from us. It was a flight of desperation, led by Edward, who was straining to keep himself from outrunning all of us, as he dragged me along behind him. As we fled, we all took in Edward's wild look. His hair was standing up in frantic spikes where he'd run his hands through it repeatedly as we'd run. His eyes were wide, filled with anger and perhaps even a hint of fear. After we were out of hearing range, Emmett called out to Edward. "Edward, talk to us. Tell us what's going on," Emmett demanded when Edward finally came to a stop. "He's a tracker," Edward told Emmett, his eyes meeting his brother's. "He's been searching for the ultimate challenge." Edward's gaze returned to my face and his hand tightened on mine, pulling me into his arms. He found someone he could not track at all. He watched her. He gathered information on her. Then he stalked her until he felt he had enough information to track her without his abilities. When he thought he knew her well enough, he changed her. Edward's eyes were on mine as he revealed this, and I gasped in shock. "Turning you into a vampire was deliberate, Bella." Edward reached up with both hands to hold my face as he told me the worst of it. "He followed you around for weeks, thinking that whatever made it hard for him to track you as a human would make it incredibly difficult as a vampire. Whatever it is that keeps me from reading your mind must also prevent him from finding you as well. It made you immeasurably enticing to him." I almost vibrated with shock and anger. His hands were the only thing holding me up as I gasped unnecessarily for air. "My mother? Edward. Did he go after my mother?" I had to know that she was still safe. "No. He watched her for a while when they went back to Phoenix, but it was obvious you weren't there and Renee and Phil were moving things out to move to Jacksonville. He had the woman go to your school there and read your records. He thought you might move up here with your father, which is why they were headed for Charlie." Edward let his hands fall from my face and pulled me into his arms. "I'm so sorry, Bella." "Charlie," I pulled back in shock. "Are they still going after Charlie?" Edward thought about that a moment and then shook his head just slightly. "They weren't thinking about that while they were there. He was just delighted he'd found you, even by chance. The hunt is on now, Bella. He sees you as a game he created for his own pleasure. He wins when you die." Edward choked on the last word and then dragged me into a run again. Alice and Emmett close behind. I turned to look at Alice, who had been silent so far, trying to see all the options she could see. I could nearly see the frantic future hunting on her face, while she tried to decipher all the options she could see as she ran. She was obviously trying to understand where we needed to go and what we needed to do. "Alice?" I caught her attention as we ran. "What about my father? Is he going after Charlie?" Alice thought about that a moment and then just shrugged. "He hasn't decided to do that yet, Bella, so I can't see what that future will bring. Edward would know his mind better than I would know his future where it comes to Charlie." She seemed upset by the idea, but didn't stop looking while we ran back to the house. We piled into Emmett's Jeep instead of Edward's Volvo. I was confused by that, but let Edward pull me along as we all climbed in. Edward pulled onto the main road, and then instead of heading for my house, he headed out of town. I reached out, trying to tug his attention back onto me. "Edward, where are you going? We have to get back to Charlie. We have to make sure he's safe." I knew my voice was full of the panic that filled my soul. "I'm getting you as far away from here as I can," Edward insisted, his voice harsh with fear. "He's not getting anywhere near you. We'll disappear somewhere together, you and me. You'll safe." "I might be safe, but my dad won't be. He'll go after Charlie to get me to come out of hiding." "Edward," I insisted hoarsely. "If they had intended to go after Charlie to get my attention in the first place, my running now wasn't going to stop them from doing that in the future. Pull over, now." I tugged harder on his arm, trying to pull the Jeep to the side of the road. "We are going to talk about this. I am not leaving my father in danger." "Do it," Alice insisted quietly from the back seat, when it looked like Edward wasn't going to listen to me. "Alice, did you hear what I said? This is just a game for him, and the only thing he's seeking is her death." Edward spat through clenched teeth, his eyes meeting hers in the rear-view mirror. "I know, Edward, but just hear Bellow out," Alice replied much more calmly, able to detach herself a bit better than Edward and I were doing. It must have worked, however, because Edward pulled over to the side of the road finally, turning far enough that he could see me and Alice clearly. That made me even angrier on top of everything else I was feeling. He couldn't trust what I was saying. He had to wait for Alice to agree first. That kind of behavior was not going to continue, but that was something to take up with him another time. "All right, Bella," Alice said, as it looked like I had everyone's attention. "Tell us what you're thinking." "Well, he's coming after me, right?" I asked for confirmation from Edward, and he nodded. "Well, let's just make it so that Charlie becomes useless as a pawn. Take me home. I'll have a fight of some kind with Charlie. I'll tell him that I can't live here anymore. I'm going back to Phoenix, and then I'll stomp out and leave him safe." I looked up at Alice in question to make sure that I was still making sense in my moments of sheer terror. She nodded at me to go on, and I looked over at Edward as I continued, knowing he was the one to convince. He wasn't going to take chances with my life. "Then I can go anywhere you like. In fact, the best thing would be for us to split up." I winced at the pure rejection in his eyes before I kept going. Faster this time. "Hear me out. He's going to think that you won't leave me, and I can see by the look on your face, he's right. Well, he won't track me. He can't, so he'll track you to get to me, Edward. If I'm safe somewhere else, you can draw him in and convince him that killing me isn't a good idea, and then it's all over." "He won't stop until one of you is dead, Bella," Edward said, his eyes hard as they met mine. "He won't ever stop." "He doesn't stop. This is all there is to his existence. These games he comes up with. Then you'll have to kill him, I guess," I said as I met his eyes, returning his look evenly. I didn't want to condone anyone's death, but if it came to me and my family or James, I picked James. "Yes," Emmett's voice rang out for the first time from the back seat. He must not have felt strongly enough to comment about anything yet, but that appeared to have changed. He seemed exultant as he pumped his fist. "Come on, Edward, let's hunt him down." "I'm not leaving you alone," Edward insisted, his hand reaching for mine, his long fingers brushing over my skin in a loving gesture. "Jasper and I will stay with her," Alice piped up from the back seat, sighing happily as a clearer future seemed to unfold in her mind. "There, that one works for me. Take us back to Charlie's, Edward." Edward focused in on Alice's thoughts for a moment, before he leaned in to kiss me softly, his hands cupping my face again, and then he turned the Jeep around on the road and headed back into town. "You have to promise me something, Bella," he insisted, as he drove, part of his attention on the area around us, looking for the mind of the hunter, I guessed. He glanced over at me before he turned his attention back to driving. "I need you to be safe. What I said that night that you met with the werewolves is still the case. Perhaps even more so. You are everything that is important to me, and I need to know that you're safe while I'm hunting." I tried to smile, but I'm sure it came across as more of a grimace. I slid as close to him as I could, and I reached out to put my hand on his arm. "Alice and Jasper will keep me out of trouble, Edward, but I need you to be safe too. There's not much point in any of it anymore, for me, if something happens to you." I was perfectly serious. Edward was the entirety of my world now, just as he said that I was his. His head turned just enough to look at me, and he then sped up. He stiffened as we pulled into the drive at Charlie's house. I knew his attention was focused outside himself, there more than with me. He was searching all the nearby thoughts for James and Victoria. "You have 15 minutes, Bella," he warned me. "No more, no less. If you want the tracker to hear your fight with Charlie." I nodded, sliding out of the Jeep, and walked with Edward to the front door. I leaned up to kiss him and rubbed my cheek against his. He held me tightly for a moment and then released me with an admonition to hurry. "Edward, I love you. I will always love you. Promise me that you won't listen to anything else that I say in this house tonight." I looked up into his eyes as I took a step back. At his nod, I turned, banged open the door, and slammed my way into the house. "I don't ever want to see you again, Edward Cullen," I yelled as I slammed the door in his face. He was instantly gone, around the house and into my bedroom window. I heard him moving around in my bedroom as I stomped noisily to the stairs. My dad was right there, and wanted to know what had happened. I didn't stop to explain anything to him. It was too soon. Instead, I just stormed into my room. I'd need clothes to wear, since I had no idea how long I would be gone. I walked into my room and shut the door, took the bag that Edward thrust at me, and started shoving things inside it from my drawers. "Bella?" my dad questioned from outside the door, not daring to push past the barrier to find out what was going on. However, that didn't mean that he wasn't going to push to get me to talk to him. I kissed Edward on the cheek and then walked out into the hallway with my dad. I clattered into the bathroom to pack up the things there that I would need, pushing past my bewildered father. "I'm going home," I insisted, ignoring the stunned look on my dad's face. I just can't be here anymore. He's too perfect. What does he want with me? I tossed shampoo, my toiletry bag, and whatever else I could grab quickly that looked important into my duffel bag and zipped it closed. Turning on my heel, I headed downstairs again, oriented toward the front door when my dad stopped me. From Edward's estimate, it was time for the show. Bella, you can't go home. Your mother's already moved. There's no one there. Charlie tried to reason with me, but I couldn't give him any leeway on this. I had to protect him. I can't stay here, Dad. Everything is too perfect. My life doesn't do perfect. Everything goes to crap eventually, and I won't be able to handle it. I insisted. I carefully broke his hold on my arm and continued toward the door again. Bella, you can't drive all that way this late at night. I'm not sure your truck is up to a trip like that. I loved my father. He was the best dad any girl could wish for. I hated doing this to him, but I didn't have any choice. I reached the front door and opened it. Turning back to him one more time, I said the one thing guaranteed to break his heart and force him to let me go. They were the same words my mother had used when she left him. Just let me go, Charlie. He was still standing there, stunned, when I hopped into my truck and revved the engine as I took off. Edward was crouched down on the seat, waiting until we were out of sight of my father before he sat up next to me and nudged me inward as he took over driving. I let him without protest or comment, too upset to want to drive, though my vampire reflexes could have easily done it no matter how upset I was. I looked back over my shoulder just as Emmett jumped into the bed of the truck, reinforcing my protection since I thought James must still be close. I could hear the engine of the Jeep just behind us and figured Alice was driving it. Did he take the bait, Edward? I turned to look at the love of my life driving my truck. He was still so very upset. He did, Edward said softly, heading directly to his house to coordinate the rest of the flight with his family. He's running behind us right now. He'll meet up with the redhead near our house. I nodded then, reaching up to brush my hair out of my face and letting my head fall onto the seat beside me. I only stayed there for a moment before I slid across the bench seat to press myself into Edward's side. He let go of the wheel with the hand closest to me and wrapped it around my shoulders to pull me closer. It will all work out, Bella. I promise you that. Whatever I have to do in order to make you safe again, his voice was fervent with sincerity. I didn't want that. Not at the cost of him or his soul. Edward, I reached up to caress the side of his face. I don't want you to do anything that you will regret. Kill him if you must. But come back to me healthy and intact. He just smiled down at me, humoring my words, though I knew he would never make me that sort of promise. He was determined to do whatever he had to in order to keep me safe. I just leaned in closer to him, as close as I could manage, trying to get in as much of his touch as I could before we had to be separated. I need you to come back to me, Edward. I couldn't hide the fear in my voice at this point. His death isn't worth yours. I need you to really understand that. There is no Bella without Edward. I am honestly not sure I could live without you now. I tilted my head to look up at him, begging him with my eyes to understand, to accept that he really was my entire world, the center of anything that made my life worth living. He hugged me tighter to him and sighed softly. As you are to me, you are my life as well. He leaned over and kissed the top of my head as we drove up to his house. I'll have Carlisle and Emmett to keep me safe. You make sure that you are just as safe for me. Just as long as that promise goes both ways, Edward. No sacrifices, I insisted, looking out, scanning the area and the trees before I hopped out of the truck right behind Edward. We darted up the stairs to the porch together, and were in the house in the blink of an eye. Carlisle met us at the door, Laurent with him, though the other man looked like he was preparing to leave. Edward immediately pulled me to the side and crouched down, ready to attack or defend as needed. I was pushed behind Emmett as he entered, and then Alice stepped forward to shield me. I was gently forced to the side so there was only a wall at my back. I sighed softly, shaking my head. I wasn't totally defenseless. Wait! Carlisle stopped Edward before he could attack. I don't want to get into the middle of this, Laurent told Edward as he held his hands up and took a step back. But there are things you should know about James if you intend to try and keep her alive. It is all about the game for him, and she is the most exciting thing he's ever seen in all his years. He's uncanny. But also, don't underestimate Victoria. As a pair, they are ruthless, and I have never seen them bested. That is why I joined their coven. I let out a long, slow breath. This was another one of James's games. He had to make everyone believe that he was a follower when he was anything but. Did he think it made him safer? He's merciless, Laurent observed, as he turned to edge around us to the door. He's the most dangerous vampire I've ever seen in all my years, and he will never stop. Never. As he opened the door, Laurent turned to look at me and then back at Edward. He keeps me around to assess how much fun the game will be for him, Lorraine provided, and I leaned around Alice, trying to get a read on whether or not he was telling the truth. It is always more fun for him if his quarry is defended, if it is harder to get to her. He used me to assess the companions of his quarry, to see how strong their bonds are. Laurent glanced at me again, then back at Edward, and he shook his head slightly. No matter what I tell him, he does what he wants, and never backs down. Laurent looked to Carlisle briefly before his eyes returned to Edward. I could see that you would all do much for her, but I have never seen a bond so strong as the one I see between the two of you, even with other vampires. Take care, I have never seen him fail. With that, Laurent was gone. Carlisle said that he was taking the advice given and heading to Denali to visit the coven there, to see if the lifestyle we lived was something that he could embrace. I wished him luck. It had to be difficult for him to live so completely under James's thumb. I just hoped that he didn't cause problems for Carlisle's friends in Alaska while he was there. Someone who had run so long with James could not be entirely innocent. More than the Cullen's Alaskan family, I was worried about us. I didn't like splitting everyone up, and I didn't like Edward going after James without me. There were so many ways that things could go wrong, and he would be so far away from me. I wouldn't be able to come to his aid if he needed me. I also knew that he wouldn't be able to fight as effectively if he had to worry about keeping me safe at the same time. It pained me to admit it, but it was possible that I would put him more at risk with my presence. That is why I decided to let Alice and Jasper take me into hiding. I had to have faith that Edward would join us again, quickly, and I'd be able to get back to the life we were creating together. Edward turned back to me as Laurent left and reached out for my hand, dragging me over to where Esme stood. He wore his worry openly on his face. Rosalie stood beside Esme as they waited, and Edward placed me in front of his sister with a glance up at her. Rose, trade clothes with Bella. You can take her scent, and you and Esme can head off in a different direction. Alice and I figure that the woman will follow you too. Edward explained quietly as he turned to look at Alice, confirming the thoughts she was sharing with him. Why do I have to do that? Rosie interjected, her tone laced with contempt. She's never brought this family anything but trouble. Rose, Esme gasped in shock, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Esme? Edward just turned his look to Esme and tilted his head toward her, directing the question to his mother and completely ignoring Rosia. Esme grabbed my hand and dragged me with her upstairs into the first room we came to. We were both a flurry of activity, switching clothes and putting on what the other was taking off. When we were both dressed, I reached up and pulled Esme's hair into a ponytail, securing it with the hair tie that had been in my hair, and dropped the hat on her head that Emmett had put on me earlier. Leaving my hair free, I pushed her hat down on my head and smiled at her weakly as she grabbed my hand again and led me downstairs. When we got down the stairs, everyone was moving, except for Rosie. She stood against a wall, arms crossed over her chest, scowling at everyone, especially me. The wall of windows was now covered with wicked-looking shutters that had to be made of steel, perhaps something stronger. Edward reached for me as we appeared at the bottom of the stairs. The look he cast at Samay was grateful and relieved as he grabbed my hand and pulled me out toward the garage. The rest of the family was close behind us, filling the separate cars with all types of gear and luggage. Edward took me off to the side, wrapped me up tightly in his arms as he buried his face in my hair. Be careful, he said against my cheek as his lips pressed softly into my skin. I don't like leaving you. We'll do this for a few days, and if we don't find him, I'll come and get you. We'll go somewhere safe then. All right? I nodded, pressing my face into his shoulder. I never wanted to let him go. Edward, you have to be safe too. You and Charlie. Otherwise, none of the rest of this matters. I couldn't clearly express how I felt about him leaving to hunt the man that killed me. I was terrified. Esme and Rosalie will stay here and keep Charlie safe after they lead the woman off, Edward told me as Alice appeared at his elbow. Time to go, Edward. You have to lead that tracker away before we can get her out of here, she reminded him, before she disappeared again. She tossed my bag and several others into the trunk of Carlisle's Mercedes. I tilted my head to look up at him to say goodbye, but he stopped me with a kiss. His lips were warm and insistent on mine, giving me the kiss that I had always wanted, but he'd always seemed to be so careful not to allow. I threw my arms around his neck, returning the kiss with the same near panic that seemed to be affecting him, and after a moment he drew away, returning after a brief hesitation to rain light kisses all over the surface of my face. "Be safe, my Bella," he finally said softly as he pulled on my arms, releasing my hold on him as he stepped back. He placed one last kiss on my lips and then stepped away, his expression changing as he did so. He looked feral, far more fierce than when we'd been hunting together. This was his battle face, and it frightened me a little to see it on my sweet, gentle Edward. I was dismayed that I had brought the circumstances that made him feel this horrible need to do whatever he had to in order to eliminate a threat against me. Alice appeared at my elbow, guiding me toward Carlisle's car and gently directing me into the back seat. I watched Edward get into the big Jeep with Emmett and Carlisle, and it sped out of the garage and down the drive. Alice stood outside the passenger door of the Mercedes and waited. Moments later, her phone started to ring. She answered it and then gestured to Rosie and Esme. They hopped into my truck and were off, drawing the woman whom we were hoping would think Esme was me. Alice's phone rang again after a few minutes, and she slid into the car, gesturing to Jasper. As her door shut, he hit the gas, and the car took off down the road. I lay down in the back seat. We weren't really sure Laurent had moved on, so we weren't going to make it easy for them to figure out our scheme. "Are you sure, Bella?" Alice asked me a few minutes later as we hit the main road and were well on our way to the freeway. "You won't expect us to go where I said I was going," I said quietly, looking up at her from the seat where I was lying. "Very well," Alice said softly, looking over at Jasper. "I hope you'll be fine without being able to hunt as often. We won't be able to head into the desert. It's too risky." She turned to look back at me, and on her face was concern and sympathy. I just shrugged in response. I do what I had to do. This was part of keeping Charlie safe. Besides, I was more determined than ever that as little as possible connected me with James, and drinking human blood was the most important part of that resolution. She grinned at me encouragingly as she reached back to offer me her hand in support. "It will all work out, Bella," Alice said gently before she released my hand and turned to take Jasper's on the console between them. The ride to Phoenix was fast. It didn't take nearly as long to get where you were going, when you only had to stop for gas. After we got out of the greater Seattle area, I sat up, no longer feeling the need to hide. The slim silver phone Edward had given me lay dormant in my hand, and I stared at it for hours on end as Jasper and Alice spoke quietly in the front seat. I felt so ridiculous. It was the only thing that I had been able to bring that Edward had given me, and it felt like a lifeline. It was a small portion of him that I could hold to make it feel like he really wasn't so far away after all. The phone didn't ring. They were still trying to hide from James that I wasn't with them, so they couldn't risk that any communication between us might give the game away. My hand curled around the phone yet again as I tilted my head to look out the window and watch the miles pass by in a blur. I avoided looking at the speedometer since I knew that Jasper had buried the needle most of the drive. Some part of my mind was aware of the mundane things that Alice and Jasper were talking about. The route we were taking, the places to stop and get gas, the type of hotel to stay in when we arrived, and the location of the airport. Sometimes Alice would turn and clarify some part of Phoenix's geography with me, and I would direct them quietly, my mind still on Edward and James and whether they were perhaps coming head to head even now. I had faith in Edward, but I was so focused on what it would do to me if I lost him. I had a hard time accepting that a fight between them was inevitable. I knew Edward had Emmett and Carlisle, and they wouldn't allow anything to happen to him if they could prevent it. The logical mind was aware of all the things that we had going for us that would ensure Edward came back to me, but my heart wasn't easily convinced. Admittedly, where Edward was concerned, my heart was the dominant factor. Jasper drove as fast as Edward did, faster than anyone ought to drive. I had to admit that our reflexes were much better suited to driving fast than a human's. To drive like Edward and Jasper did would be downright suicidal for a human, and I was still my father's daughter. I'd been brought up to obey the law. Traffic laws were one of those things my father had been quite focused on, especially as I was learning how to drive. I didn't object to anyone's crazy driving today. However, I didn't attempt to suggest that Jasper slow down and keep to the laws. I sat almost in a daze in the back seat, watching the miles go by in abject worry. We chose a hotel near the airport in Phoenix, anticipating that the boys would be able to finish this quickly and we'd be that much closer when Edward was finally able to join us. I was eager at the thought of having Edward on the next plane and back in my arms. Alice and Jasper checked in while I hid in the car. We didn't want anyone to see me, leaving clues that I was here. But also, I didn't trust myself around humans right now, as stressed out as I felt. Alice and Jasper came back with a key, and we grabbed the luggage and headed into the room. Jasper turned the TV on so that we could keep up with anything in the news that might be pertinent. You never knew the kind of things were so clearly something perpetrated by one of our kind that humans dismissed as unsolvable mysteries. I dropped onto the couch, curling my legs up into my chest. I tried not to look at Alice and Jasper as I did so. They weren't as openly demonstrative as Rosie and Emmett were, but it still reminded me that the center of my world wasn't with me. He was going into danger because of me, but without me, it was almost impossible for me to come to terms with that. I felt like I should be with him, watching his back. Time passed. Interminable. Endless. It seemed like I was waiting away the entirety of my life. It would have been easier had I been able to sleep. But I sat on the couch, staring mindlessly at the TV and waiting. Not long after noon, on our third day in Phoenix, Alice stiffened suddenly from her spot on the couch, and I could see her eyes still in the way that they did when she was having a particularly strong vision. Jasper came to attention and moved over to her side, leaving the window he'd been peering out of in order to take her hand. I was already beside her and leaned over, trying to see into her eyes. "Alice," I questioned her softly, "what do you see?" "It's a room," Alice said, her voice distant and quiet. "Mirrors cover the walls, and there's a bar across them about waist height." "What, like a ballet studio?" That was the only thing I could think of with mirrors in a bar. Alice and Jasper focused on me quickly, surprised at my sudden understanding. "What?" I was surprised by their reaction. "My mother insisted that I take ballet once when I was a kid. That was a disaster." I kept knocking over the other dancers. "The studio I went to is just down the street from the house that my mom still owns here." Alice gave Jasper a look, and then he slid some paper and a simple charcoal pencil down in front of her on the coffee table. She took the pencil in hand and started giving an outline of a room with mirrors and arches and a bar anchored to the wall. I tilted my head to watch her and then nodded in agreement after a moment. "Yeah, that's how I remember it," I said softly, pointing at the arches over the doorways. "This is the main entrance, and there's an exit here and here. This is where I fell and broke my ankle." I pointed to a spot in front of one of the mirrors. "Is this the same room, Bella?" Alice asked me gently. "Is it similar or the same?" At that, I could only give her a shrug in answer. "Alice, it's been since I was fairly young and human, and you know how human memories are after our change. This experience was particularly unpleasant, so I don't remember it very well. It could be the same place. Those arches are pretty unique." Alice looked down at the picture for a long moment. Who knew what else she was seeing in her head? I waited as long as I could, and then I interrupted her. "Alice," I had to know what she was seeing. "Something has changed, Bella. All I see now is darkness and then this room." She shook her head and then picked up her phone a moment before it rang. "Yes," she said into the phone as she answered it. I heard the rumble of Edward's voice, and my mind focused in on the sound of it more than the words he was saying to Alice. "Yes, he's changed his mind. I see darkness, and then this room that Bella thinks is a ballet studio. It's here in Phoenix," she informed him in her lyrical voice. There was silence on the other end of the phone after that. After a short pause, I heard Edward say quite clearly, "We'll be on the next plane. Let me talk to her." Alice then handed the phone to me, and I was far too eager to grab it and raise it up to my ear. "Edward!" "Bella!" His voice was full of relief at the sound of mine, and I smiled. I felt as relieved as he sounded. "You're staying out of trouble?" "How could I not? Alice and Jasper are taking good care of me." Although I'd felt my hunger rise day by day, and I knew that I would have to hunt very soon. "We're on our way. I'll be there with you later tonight." "I miss you, Bella." I rose and walked into the suite's bedroom, wanting a little more privacy with my love. "The past few days without you have been unbearable." "I know what you mean," I told him. "All I'd done was stare at walls." "Please hurry. I don't like being without you." "It won't be much longer, my darling," he told me. And then we said our goodbyes as he rushed off to catch the first plane that he could. I didn't like that Alice's vision placed James back here in Phoenix, but Edward was coming to be with me, and that eclipsed almost anything else. Suddenly I was aware that I was here, in Phoenix. My dad was upset and worried, and he would have told my mother that I was headed here. I didn't want her in the middle of this mess. I made a soft noise of panic and called her cell phone. She didn't answer. I called the number of the new house in Jacksonville. Again, no answer. I dialed the house here in Phoenix, and no answer. I left messages at all 3 places. Mom, I'm all right. There's nothing to worry about. Call me when you get this message, and I'll tell you all about it. Don't try to meet me in Phoenix. I won't be there. Here's the number where you can reach me. And I rattled off the numbers of the cell phone. Edward had given me that day we'd met and then hung up the phone. At that point, I returned to the other room, handing Alice her phone, and I smiled at her for the first time in days. They're coming here, I told her, even though she already knew. Yes, I know, Bella. He told me too, you know. Alice admonished with a smile on her face as she teased me. Yes, but I just needed to say it. I dropped on the couch beside her to wait. I sat there a long moment, staring at the ceiling, and then I turned to look at Alice again and found her looking back at me as though patiently waiting. I laughed. She knew what I was going to ask, but still, she waited until I asked the questions, letting me do this in my own way. Alice, why? Why is he so fixated on you? Why can't he track you? She made sure to clarify for my sake what I was asking. I nodded. Don't take my opinion as gospel, Bella, but I can tell you what I think. I have no problems at all seeing your future. Jasper, he can feel your emotions and manipulate them easily, but Edward has no access to your mind at all, and James cannot track you. She summed up the things that we did know without a shadow of a doubt. Her eyes met mine again as she continued. Now, the rest of this is just my opinion. All the things you seem immune to occur within your own mind. I see outcomes of things. These events are outside your mind. Jasper, he affects the chemistry of your body. How you are physically feeling, also outside your mind. But Edward, his ability is obviously very focused directly on the mind. As far as James, I can only guess it is the same thing. He tracks as many trackers do based upon the flavor or the feel of the mind he is hunting. I blinked at her words several times as I tried to absorb everything she'd said. This had caused so much havoc in my life. So, there's more going on with me than this super self-control that Jasper was teasing me about. I looked at Alice again as I tried to reason it all out in my mind. So much of this was about things I had no experience with. Oh yes, Bella, the rest of us have known that from the very beginning. Alice smiled at me gently. Carlisle believes that you are some sort of shield, the Volturi have won, but she is quite different from you. She is able to repel physical attacks. You seem to be able to lock one and all completely out of your mind. It's quite rare, Bella, and you are especially strong. A text interrupted us then with the details of Edward's flight. He was bringing Carlisle and Emmett, and they were coming in late, about 10,000 p.m. It was a safe hour in Phoenix for us to be out and about, but it still seemed too long to me. I'd have dressed in a burqa if that meant getting Edward and me together more quickly. Suddenly, Alice looked over at me and blinked in surprise. Billy, why do I see you in a burqa? Her tone was horrified, and Jasper laughed from his favorite perch near the window. I was just thinking that I'd dress in a burqa to hide from the sun if that meant I could get to Edward more quickly, I told her with a smile, and she shuddered in reaction. Yes, but a burqa? Bella, there are much prettier ways to hide your skin from the sun. Then she paused. All right, I'll admit that there might be pretty burqas out there, but I can make you look lovelier in scarves. I had to laugh at her response. She'd been following me around for days, trying to get me in pretty clothes. Apparently, she'd brought a bag of things she wanted me to wear, and she kept trying to get me to put on the most outrageous things. She'd brought skirts, dresses, and high heels with spiked ends. She was determined to get me into something utterly feminine. I'd been staring at the TV or the wall the entire time, and just shaking my head at her whenever she'd suggest I change. Since Edward had called, however, it was like I had come alive. Speaking of scarves, Alice said leadingly, and I laughed. You aren't going to give up, are you? I demanded, able to see the humor in the situation now. Of course not. Please? I want you to look beautiful when Edward arrives. She grabbed my hand and tried to look endearing, and I sighed but nodded. Fine, I said as she dragged me to my feet and toward the bedroom. But no dresses. Alice pouted but gave in as she knew that my agreeing to let her dress me at all was a concession. That doesn't eliminate skirts, she reminded me as Jasper started to laugh again, watching her drag me off. I know, but please, be gentle with me, Alice. I don't even know how to walk in some of those shoes. My tone turned begging. I was begging. Alice had a tendency to get carried away. By the time she was done, I was dressed in a knee-length skirt of dark blue, a lighter blue short-sleeved V-neck cashmere sweater, and a pair of black espadrilles that tied up my ankle. The skirt was flared, flowing out around my legs like a ballroom dancer's dress as I moved, making me feel pretty and girly. Alice being Alice, she'd insisted on matching accessories, and I sat on the bed like an obedient fashion doll as she completed her masterpiece. Flashing blue gems accented my ears, dangling from delicate silver loops. A twist of silver wrapped around my neck, holding gently onto a matching blue teardrop. Finally, she threw a tennis bracelet full of blue gems around one of my wrists. I peered at the bracelet and then looked up at her, my eyes wide. "Alice, if you have draped me in a fortune of sapphires, I don't want to know," I told her quietly, terrified of losing even one of the earrings. "Oh, don't be silly, Bella," she admonished me. "It's not like you won't notice if one of them falls out or something." She was right. My senses were so much more acute now that I could measure the exact shift of the metal through the holes in my ears. I took in a deep breath, continuing my statue impression as she twisted my hair up into a loose chignon at the back of my head, pulling several tendrils free and curling them about a curling iron that had suddenly appeared. It made me suspicious. She'd planned this very carefully. "Alice," I said as she finished and allowed me to rise, "you are a very dangerous vampire. You really frighten me. I think you scare me more than the idiots who killed me." I was quite serious. Was there nothing Alice wouldn't do to get her way? Especially if getting her way was dressing me up like some pretty Barbie doll. I didn't even know if Edward would like it. It was so much more different from my usual look that I was afraid what he'd think. I didn't think he was so shallow that a change in how I dressed would drive him away from me, but there was enough self-conscious teenager left in me that I did worry about his reaction. Alice just laughed at the look on my face. "Trust me, Bella, he's going to love it." "You do trust me, right?" She batted her eyes at me and I sighed softly. "Of course I do, Alice. But this is so not me." I turned around gracefully on the heels and the skirt flared out around me. Alice took my hand as I came to a stop, and she tugged on it as she demanded my attention be focused completely on her. "Bella, you are in love with a vampire that is over 100 years old. His formative years were during a time when women wore only dresses. In fact, when he was a boy, they were covered from ankle to wrist to chin by fabric," she explained to me. I gasped in shock. I wasn't going to put on a dress that covered that much. I wouldn't be able to move. Alice laughed again. "No, he doesn't want to see you that covered up, Bella. Thank goodness. I'm just saying that these men appreciate a woman in a skirt or a dress. You feel pretty and feminine, and it makes them see you as more feminine too. My Jasper's the same way." She talked me out of my mild fit of panic, and I could only hug her. "You're a good sister, you know that?" Swung her around, and she laughed at me and dragged me out of the room. "Come on, we've lots of time to wait still, and we might as well torment Jasper while we're at it." Her smile turned mischievous as she opened the door, and I laughed. She was going to torment Jasper, and I was going to do my best to ignore them as I waited impatiently for my sweetheart to arrive. "Looking good, Bella," Jasper said with a smile as we came into the main room, and he walked over to greet Alice with a kiss. "She give you her be a woman for your man speech?" I narrowed my eyes at her and tilted my head to the side in irritation. I didn't like being played, even if it was for a good cause. Apparently, I didn't know it was its own speech. How often does she use it? I almost growled at her, though not seriously. I wouldn't attack Alice, and I am sure Jasper could feel the lack of intent in my emotions. "Not that often, Bella," she defended, smacking Jasper on the arm for giving away one of her secrets. "Besides, you needed it. She looks great, doesn't she, Jazz?" "You do look great, Bella," Jasper confirmed as he wrapped his arms around Alice and smiled down at her. "You'd say anything to make her happy, even if I looked like the Loch Ness Monster," I grumbled at him as I flopped onto the couch in a flurry of blue. Too much blue, I thought, but Alice was so sure and so happy, and she and Jasper were doing so much for me that I didn't feel it right to grouse too much. At that point, my phone rang, and I lifted it gratefully, noticing the caller ID said it was my mother's house here in Phoenix. I told Alice who it was, as I rushed into the bedroom and closed the door. I knew they'd hear me anyway, but I wanted as much privacy as they could give me. I hit the receive button on the phone and lifted it to my ear. "Mom?" I said into the phone, afraid she was going to go totally nuts on me. "Bella? Bella?" my mother's voice demanded, and I cringed. She was frantic. It sounded as panicked as that time I'd fallen on a large crack in the pavement and broken my wrist as I tried to break my fall. "Mom, I'm fine. Everything is all right. Let me explain." except that I really didn't know how to explain any of it. There was actual silence on the end of the line for a long moment, and I started to worry. "Mom," I tried to draw her out, make sure she was okay. "It is very important that you be very careful, Bella," the voice on the other end of the phone advised me, "and it wasn't my mother's. You don't want anything to happen to your mother, do you?" This is where a large part of my logical brain shut down, and my vision misted over with red. I felt the anger coursing through my body. It was deeper, stronger than I had felt when I'd nearly attacked Mike Newton. This consumed me, the need to fight and kill. I understood better than ever what that look on Edward's face had meant when he'd left me. It had been this. I could not contain the low growl of warning that escaped my lips. He hissed softly into the phone in the most irritating manner I could imagine. "Careful now, Bella," James said to me from the phone in my mother's house. "You don't want your traveling companions to know that something is wrong. That would be detrimental to your mother's health, if you get my meaning." I barely withheld a hiss of anger and then tried to gain control of myself. "Now, I want you to say yes, Mom. I'm just fine," James advised me, and I parroted him as calmly as I could, as though I was really talking to my mother. "You have to get away from your babysitters," he told me, not leaving any options open for me. "Can you do that?" "Of course, Mom. You shouldn't have come home." I wanted him to understand my double meaning. I would get away if I had to, but he shouldn't have come here. He should not have taken my mother, and he would not get away with threatening my family. "I'll be at the ballet studio around the corner from your house at 11 Eastern tonight. You will come alone," James said very quietly. He wanted to make sure that Alice and Jasper didn't overhear a thing. "Of course, Mom. I'll explain everything later. I promise. You go back to Phil and be safe. I'll call you later." James had long since hung up, but I had to continue the charade so that Alice wouldn't suspect anything, though that wasn't likely to work. Alice knew everything. I said my fake goodbyes, closed the phone, and then made my way back into the living area and flopped down on the couch, throwing my arm over my eyes. Alice and Jasper left me alone, probably thinking that it must have been a difficult call with my mother. Little did they know, as I lay there, my mind started going over all the possibilities. I didn't let that feral part of me rise again just yet. I didn't think that was something that I could hide from Alice. And then she wouldn't let me go to the airport to meet Edward. It was imperative that I be able to go. That was where I would make my escape. One of the bathrooms on the main concourse had a secondary exit that not many people were as aware of. I would go into the bathroom to check my contacts and then slip out the other side. I would be in a cab and on my way back home before they noticed that I was gone. At least I hoped that was the case. As the time came closer and closer, my mind jumped from how I would get away from Alice to what I would do when I got to the studio. This was the room Alice had seen. Of that I was sure. I wondered what her vision had been. What she had seen in that room, I hoped that it had not been my death. I made plans within plans within plans, exploring my options of how I would get my mother free, how I would fight James if I had to. I did not intend to be the one to die if anyone had to die tonight. In fact, a part of my mind was entirely focused on how I could use the things I had learned from Edward's family to defend myself, and how I would kill James. Edward had never been able to bring himself to teach me how to fight, but I had learned a few things in the training sessions with Emmett and Jasper. I thought that I could at least keep myself alive until Edward came for me. I knew absolutely that he would come. I didn't think there was anything that would keep him from finding his way to me once he got off that plane. I had already given Alice enough information to get him to the ballet studio before too much time had passed. In fact, I was counting on it. I delayed as we moved to leave to meet the others. I messed with my contacts, had issues with my outfit, feigned nervousness about how I looked, and tried to get Alice to let me change. I was stalling. I couldn't allow too much free time in the airport if I was going to get free. Alice seemed to put up with me for the most part, but she finally dragged me out to the car, insisting that even if I wanted a burqa, she couldn't find one in the amount of time we had left. She made me laugh, even in my upset. Before I knew it, I was shaking my head at her as I finally gave in and climbed into the car. Jasper stayed right with me as we went into the airport. I knew he could feel my nervousness, and I hoped that he would attribute it to being in an airport packed full of people. Although I had done this once before, I hadn't been this hungry, and experience didn't make this any easier. As we passed the bathroom that I needed, I pulled Alice to a stop, keeping one of my eyes closed. "Alice, I think my contact is dissolving early. I'll have to replace it," I told her softly as I backed toward the bathroom. "Go on to the gate. I'll meet you there." She looked at me, looked at Jasper, and then shooed me off. "Fine, But Jazz will wait here for you. Hurry up, their plane has already landed. Alice turned to go her own way as I smiled apologetically at Jasper and made my way into the bathroom. Hiding things from Alice? I didn't think that was possible. My plan was too well thought out for it to be a surprise for her. She had to know what I was planning. What I didn't know yet was if she was going to let me get away with it. I slid right through that bathroom and out the other side, darting into the stream of people making their way through the airport and out to the curb, where I stole a cab out from under someone else's nose. They were still cursing me when I closed the door and the driver pulled away from the curb. I gave the cab driver the address for the market around the corner from the ballet studio. In case things went badly, I knew that the less attention drawn to anywhere vampires were going to be, the better. As the driver headed out onto the freeway, I leaned back against the seat and tried to work out every plan that I could imagine for every circumstance that was possible. There were the possibilities where he had my mother and the ones where he didn't. There were ones where he'd hurt her and ones where he hadn't. There was even one just in case I showed up and he'd already killed her. I had to be ready for the possibility, but I was afraid that if he'd hurt or killed my mother, the feral part of me washed in crimson would just take over and I would do my best to kill him. Part of the scenarios in my mind were to consider what he looked for, what he wanted from my reactions, how I could do the unexpected to throw him off. The cab ride seemed like forever, yet not long enough for me to go through all the contingency plans for anything that could happen. I really missed Edward. I wanted him with me. I wanted to kiss him again, to hold his hand, to dream about a future together. One of the scenarios that I'd considered was James attacking me as I stepped in the door, tearing me apart. I would be ready for it. I would do my best to live long enough for Edward and his family to get to me, but I had to be willing to stall or to fight in order to stay alive. I was ready as the cab pulled up at the market, and I paid the driver quietly and got out. I waited until he'd driven off and then started to walk quickly down the street, as quickly as I thought I could get away with while still appearing human. It only took a few moments before I was in front of the ballet studio that I had trained in so briefly as a child. At one point, my mother thought that the clumsiness could be trained out of me. She was sure that all I needed were a few dance lessons. Give me some experience in graceful movement, and I'd pick that right up. I wouldn't be clumsy anymore. What she learned is that a clumsy girl trying to perform ballet can take down an entire row of girls at a single recital. She gave up at that point, thank goodness. I stood outside the door for a moment, taking a deep breath and getting myself ready. I looked at the little purse Alice had insisted that I carry and then looped it around my neck and under my arm so that it wouldn't easily fall off, but couldn't be used to wrap around my neck. Alice made such a big deal about carrying it that perhaps it was more than fashion and might just contain something that I might need in the short term. Whatever happened from here on out, I had done my best to prepare. Time was up. The deadline had been reached, and I was stepping forward into the future. One way or the other, only one of us was going to leave this building alive, and I intended it to be me. I opened the door and stepped inside. The interior of the building was dark and closed up. From the sign on the door, they were enjoying spring break with the rest of the country. I almost missed those days, at least the ones where school vacations were carefree and empty of cold-hearted, bloodthirsty murderers. I heard the sound of my mother calling my name from the back studio. I recognized it this time. The sound, the pitch, it was all the same. A recording rewound to repeat again and again. Hope rose in me, if my mother wasn't here, that evened the odds quite a bit in my favor. I strode toward the back room, moving silently even in the pretty shoes Alice had made me wear. I did wish, however, that I hadn't agreed to let her put me in a skirt. Pretty, but not the best thing for fighting evil vampires. Admittedly, she had dressed me before the phone call, and before I'd made the decision that put me in this ballet studio. She should not have known then. I truly didn't think I'd gotten anything over on her in the airport. I hoped that she had rallied the troops, and they were on their way. Carefully, I made my way through the back room and to the TV that was playing one of my home movies. Yes, my mother yelling frantically because I'd fallen and bloodied or broken something was the standard fare in our house. I turned it off and then turned feeling the hunter was nearby. I watched as he walked toward me. James. He'd been waiting near the entrance of the room as I'd guessed, and he had done nothing while he watched me turn off the video. It's so much easier this way, don't you think? Not involving your mother, he said as he stopped several feet away from me. Especially as she was in Jacksonville and difficult to get to in the time you had, I commented wryly. He shrugged, not caring that I'd seen through his subterfuge. He watched me carefully as though he expected the flashes of newborn temperament that Jasper was always expecting, but still hadn't seen. I smiled slowly. If he expected your typical newborn, I wasn't her. Edward liked to say that I was so much more than a newborn ever had been. As he watched me, I stepped around the cabinet. I walked normally and let my skirt swish in the hope of distracting him from the fact that I was much more dangerous than I looked. You went to a lot of trouble, I observed in a tone that sounded bored, something I had heard often from Rose. Stealing a video from my mother's house, waiting around for a message that might have never been left, making a phone call. So much effort on behalf of little old me. Sarcasm dripped from my tone, and I really hoped that he noticed that I was mocking him. He wasn't even worth my contempt anymore. Life, the giving, the taking, the living, was not a game. It certainly was not to me, and very shortly, it would no longer be a game for him either. I continued to walk, heading out to the side so that I would have room to move. It wasn't that much trouble. I had the video already. It was quite useful in getting to know you. He was so arrogant that he was taking my words at face value. That angered me. He'd watched me, stolen things from my mother that were private and cherished by her. I let the anger arise in me to fill my vision with red as the last of my contacts dissolved in the increase of venom filling my body in preparation for a fight. You did better than I expected, he commented with confusion. Did I? I tried to pull off Alice's innocent look and hoped that it worked. Or worse, depending on the point of view, no one died. There were no reports of explained deaths. No police rushing around. He sounded disappointed, and I smiled. Oh yes, I can explain that. I turned to face him, smiling slightly, as I observed everything about him all at once. He was covered in leaves and dirt, while I was dressed up like a cheerleader with a blue fetish. See, at first I was out in the desert, no people. I only had animals to drink from. I really wasn't as good at the innocent thing as Alice was. And then after I discovered that I didn't have to kill people, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't do what you would do. He stilled in the way that a vampire has of not moving at all, while he absorbed that information. I smiled slowly at him, still trying to look small and feminine. See, you made me like you, I continued, but I didn't have to be like you. I didn't have to do the things I'm sure you expected me to. If he didn't see that as the insult that it was, he wasn't as intelligent as I'd come to expect a vampire to be. Well, as far as I was concerned, it didn't matter how smart he was. He was going to die anyway. I saw the awareness grow in his eyes, and he growled at me softly. I smiled back at him. That made him even angrier, but he couldn't be as angry as I was. I was still rational, but everything in me wanted to feel him come apart under my hands. In his case, I hope it hurt. He crouched down, a hunting crouch, and his burgundy eyes focused on me. I crouched instinctively, getting ready for a fight. My basic stance matched his, but I like to think that mine was more graceful. He started to circle around, and I followed, not letting my eyes leave his, not letting the smile leave my lips. Aw, did that hurt your feelings? I taunted softly. I wanted him to lose control. I wanted him making rash decisions fed by emotion. As my tone turned scornful, he leaped at me. But I had trained in the school of Jasper, and I twisted out of the way with an easy spin of my feet and kicked his legs out from under him. As he landed, he hit the floor with a resounding crash, causing the wooden flooring to come up in places. I leaped back, crouching down with one hand on the floor, Emmett style, and I waited for him to come up. I had newborn speed and strength. I had the presence of mind of a much older vampire, and I had been training with Emmett and Jasper. I wasn't going to be the easy takedown that he'd anticipated when he created me. He pulled himself to his feet with speed that would look like a blur to a human, crouched down, and came at me again. I stepped to the side and clotheslined him, letting him fall on the ground at my feet before I leapt away again. I delighted in watching him grow more and more livid each time I took him down. As he jumped to his feet again, the full extent of his loss of control was evident in his movement and expressions as he snarled at me. This was no longer a game to him. He just wanted to see me die. This was the point I was waiting for. I held up my hand, palm toward myself, and gestured him forward with my fingers. He rushed toward me suddenly. I think he intended on tackling me to the ground. I jumped up this time, a movement I had not yet performed, and it gave him no room to anticipate me. As I came down behind him, I reached for his right arm, the one that he'd broken on me when he'd attacked me as a human. I bent down, bit his hand at the wrist, and tore until it was free from his arm. Tossing it off and into one of the corners, I then twisted out of the way again, putting myself between him and his lost limb. He wasn't going to get that part of him back easily. He roared in disbelief and outrage and leapt at me again, coming at me like a bear in a rush of claws and anger. With my next move, I took his other arm at the shoulder just before the outside doors opened and my family came blowing into the building like the wind. Edward was on him before I could react and slammed James into the floor with an intensity that made the entire building shake. He held him down while Alice danced up and touched her teeth to the side of his neck and divested James of his head. Jasper started the fire while Emmett continued with the dismemberment. I ran through the room, picking up any remaining vampire pieces and tossed them to Jasper to feed the flames of what had been the floor of the dance studio. When all of James lay in ruin consumed by fire, Emmett and Jasper ran through the building. They were deliberately spreading the fire to the other rooms to cover all evidence of a vampire battle. Edward approached me then. His manner was cautious, probably because I was staring into the flames in anger, watching the fire consume the man that had changed my life forever. "Bella?" His tone was hesitant, as though he weren't sure that I wouldn't attack him. I turned and smiled at him, and then ran toward him. I wrapped my arms around his back and took a moment to savor that he was here with me. "Let's go," he said after just a second. "We don't want to get caught in the fire, too." I smiled at him, and we left the dance studio, hand in hand. It occurred to me that I was free. James could no longer haunt me, and would no longer haunt me. My mother and father were safe from him, from his sick games. I could get on with living the rest of my life now, the rest of my very long life. We all met outside the studio, and then walked calmly and quietly down the street to where Carlisle was waiting with the car. Edward, Jasper, Alice, and I all filed into the back of the Mercedes, and Carlisle drove off carefully. I knew he was attempting to look like an innocent bystander to anyone who might notice us leaving the scene of the raging fire. I was squished up so tightly against Edward in the back seat that I might as well have been in his lap. Finally, after a couple of blocks, he pulled me into his lap with a smile. He hadn't let go of me since I jumped into his arms in the studio, and I wasn't ready to let him do so. He took advantage of having me at his mercy to run his hands over my arms and my face, checking for injuries. I just laughed. "I'm fine, Edward. He didn't touch me. You guys taught me too well, and he just couldn't compensate," I said on a sigh of mock regret. That got me smothered in his arms again, and I just laughed in delight. "You shouldn't have run off on your own like that," he said after another long moment, tilting my head back so he could look into my face. "You scared me. That was very dangerous, Bella." Of course, he would have to scold me. He still hadn't come to terms with the fact that he now had a mate, someone for him alone. I thought he was still terrified of losing me, and Alice had confirmed that just days before, as we'd waited in the hotel room. "I'm fine, Edward," I said softly, dropping a kiss on his lips. "We thought that something like this might happen and we planned for it. That's the best that we can do. Besides, it was good for me to face him like that, to let him and me know that he hadn't beaten me." "I told you, Edward, facing him was empowering for her." Alice had climbed onto Jasper's lap, leaving the back seat much roomier than before. Edward glared at her, and Carlisle and Emmett laughed in the front seat. Carlisle had been looking back at us through the rear-view mirror, and Emmett had turned in his seat to watch Edward and me openly. "I wondered why you let me sneak away like that. I knew there was no way I was going to hide anything from you, so I tried to make sure that you knew where I was going." I smiled at Alice. She was the best sister ever. Edward just frowned, shaking his head as he buried his face against my hair. "You two are going to be the death of me," he groaned against my shoulder. "Perhaps," I admitted as I pulled his head out of my hair and gave him another short kiss. "But you love us so much that you don't mind." He tried giving me a mock glare, but we'd been apart too long and it just turned into a smile as he peppered my face in kisses. "Don't run away again. I don't think my heart could take it." He tried to be stern, but he also knew I'd do it again if I had to. "Edward?" I wanted his attention and I didn't want him distracted. When he looked up at me again, I smiled. "I love you." "I love you too," he returned with a smile, and his eyes left my face to drift down over the blue that Alice had covered me in, and he groaned. "Alice, are you trying to kill me?" I blinked in surprise at that, casting her a confused look. She was smiling smugly. "Why? What's wrong, Edward?" I hated when he said something cryptic and then wouldn't explain it to me. I also wanted to know why Emmett was laughing so hard he nearly fell out of the car. "Not a thing, Bella. It's just, in that outfit, you look delicious." His voice was hoarse, like he was hurt, and I didn't understand for a long minute. Emmett started laughing harder, and I reached over to punch him in the arm as I sighed. Yet another time when I knew I'd have blushed if I'd still been human. Well, I'm glad you like it. She keeps trying to put me in dresses and skirts, and I gave in this time. I was trying to push the attention off me and back onto Alice. He could only smile as he tightened his arms around me and held me tightly. I felt complete in a way I hadn't since we'd left Washington. This was my place, my home, my refuge. Edward's arms. I never wanted to leave them again. It didn't take us very long to get back home to Forks, and we all gathered in the living room in the Cullen house. Esme and Rosalie were waiting for us there, and even Rosie and Emmett's reunion was sweet. We all took our places on the couches, the spots that seemed to have been ours from that very first day I met these people, and I smiled around at them. They felt like family now, like I belonged here, and I loved it. Charlie's safe. Those were the first words Esme said as we settled into place and she cuddled up against Carlisle's side. The woman, Victoria, stayed here for a while, trying to get through us to him, but about the time James seemed to head to Phoenix, she just left. We haven't seen any evidence of her since. I blinked in surprise. I hadn't been expecting that. I guess James had been trying to hold my dad in reserve in case he couldn't get to my mother. In the end, he hadn't needed either of them. I'd come right to him on just the threat that he had. Renee, my hand tightened around Edward's at the thought of my father in danger, and he smiled at me reassuringly. He was safe the entire time we were gone, Bella. We thought James might try to send Victoria after your father while the rest of us were distracted with him, he informed me gently, and I cast a surprised look over to Rosie where she sat on Emmett's lap on the other couch. I hadn't expected her to help defend and protect my father. I wondered if Esme had had a talk with her. Rosie just shrugged at me before she turned away again, looking like she was ignoring us completely, though I knew she still listened. What happened, Bella? Esme asked as she caught my eye. Alice told us about the phone call you got and that her vision changed, but we'd like to know the details. I glanced at Edward, knowing he'd seen Alice's visions, and I wasn't sure that he wanted me to go through the telling. This had to be difficult for him, as protective as he was of me, but he just nodded. I got a call after I left a message on my mother's machine in case she went to the house. I knew Charlie would have called her, and I didn't want her near Phoenix, if I could stop it. She still isn't answering on any of her numbers. I was worried. I still had no idea where she was. It was my mother's voice. James had stolen some home movies from my house where she was yelling out my name in panic. I continued with a smile at Edward. I had returned to his lap and settled in quite comfortably. Anyway, I agreed to meet him since I wasn't sure he hadn't actually taken my mother. No one has been able to get a hold of her. But he didn't really know where she was. I shrugged. This point wasn't important to me. There was no way of knowing why he hadn't actually taken my mother. I was just glad that he had not. I walked into the studio, turned off the video he'd stolen, and then taunted him for a bit until he attacked me. The angrier he got, the clumsier he became. He wasn't thinking any longer, and wasn't very careful about what he was doing. It made it easier to take him down. Edward growled when I admitted I'd taunted James into attacking me, and I put my hand over his mouth so that I could finish my story. Anyway, I tore off his hand and his arm. When the others arrived, they helped me finish him off. I shrugged again as though fending off a centuries-old fighter meant nothing. That's it. Not much to tell. Edward was now mock growling at me and trying to nip at my hand where it covered his mouth, and I let it fall as I glared at him. Hey, watch the teeth, I said as he grinned back at me. He seemed more easygoing about what had happened now that it was over, and we were all safe. There's just one thing that I don't understand. Alice. Why the big deal about the purse? Alice was looking back at me far too innocently. She had that wide smile on her face that inferred she'd gotten away with something, and I was just barely catching up to her. The purse? She just looked at me until I lifted the offensive object and waved it at her. Oh, that. Just a few things I thought you might need, she said as she folded her hands in her lap, demurely. That made me immediately suspicious. I opened the purse and peered inside, pulling each item out, one at a time. I pulled out a tube of lipstick, giving her a dirty look. You might have gotten chapped, Bella, she explained. Moisture is important, and we were in a desert. The next thing that came out was a black credit card in my name. I waved it at her grumpily. She flounced on Jasper's lap, letting out a sigh of disappointment. You might have needed some cash. Her tone gave a sense of desperate long-suffering, as though she were the one that had to put up with so much. Next was the cell phone. I didn't bother to make a big deal about that, and just dropped it back into the purse. Lastly, I pulled out a lighter and I grinned at it. I know what this is for, I said with a smile at her. This was so I could bake the bad guy. She grinned back and nodded. My gaze returned to her as I set the lighter on the coffee table. It matched the dress, didn't it? I finally asked. She might have put some useful items in the purse, at least things she thought were useful, but that didn't mean that she wouldn't use the lighter as an excuse to get me to carry a matching purse. Her look grew disappointed. You wouldn't have carried it otherwise, Bella, and it looked so pretty with your dress, she said with a smirk. I rolled my eyes and put the purse on the table next to the lighter. Now I just have to figure out what to tell Charlie. He's not going to accept what I told him when I stomped out of the house. It isn't going to make sense, my coming right back home. I was not looking forward to the fight that was sure to occur when I went back home. Charlie was surely going nuts, and I was sure that he'd gotten to my mother. If anyone could track her down, it was him. She'd be hysterical. I know what you could tell them, Edward said with far too much amusement in his voice, as he stole one of my hands and dropped soft, loving kisses along my fingers. I was instantly suspicious. What? I might be suspicious, but I'd take any help I could get. You could tell them I asked you to marry me and you panicked, he said in his deep velvet voice that often made me want to melt all over the floor. I drowned in the feel of his voice for a moment before the words that he'd said hit me. Then I panicked, just as he suggested I would. I jumped to my feet and I started to pace in front of the couch. You have to be kidding me. My mother would freak out. Then Charlie would have a meltdown. Next, my mother would kill me for getting so close to someone at 17 that he'd ask to marry me. I didn't stop to breathe, I just kept going, and then my father would kill me for taking off in a panic. Edward the traitor started to laugh. It was a laugh I hadn't heard from him before. A deep, utterly amused belly laugh. So I was proving him right in his assessment of my reaction. That didn't matter as much as the fact that I didn't want my parents to kill me. Just then my phone rang, and I pulled it back out of the little purse Alice had insisted went with the blue outfit. We'd been in such a rush to get back to Forks that I hadn't changed yet. I glanced at the caller ID before I hit the answer button. My mother. Finally, she was making contact. Mom? I hope this was my mother, and not Victoria saying I'd have to come to Florida to rescue my mother. Bella? It sounded like Renee. Bella? Where are you? Your father is having a fit that you've run off again. Yeah, that was my mother, and she was freaking out. Just as predicted. I'm fine. I did sort of run off again, but it wasn't something bad. I just needed some time to think. I begged her to be reasonable and not panic. You ran off? Where are you? Do I need to come get you? I knew it was a bad idea, you moving up there with your father. I could feel the rant beginning. If I didn't stop her, this could go on for a while. I had to head this off before it got really bad. Mom, I'm fine. I'm back in Washington, and I'm absolutely safe. I'm not moving to Florida, though. I'll be back at Charlie's shortly. I didn't want to tell her just how close I was. I didn't just take off. It's just, I had to think of something reasonable that she'd believe that would cause me to take off at such short notice and so frantically. Edward asked me to marry him. It came out in a rush. It was all I could come up with. That my mother would understand would freak me out. So badly. I hoped it would stop the pending tirade. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Well, I had succeeded in stopping the panic attack, but now Edward was trying desperately hard not to laugh loud enough for my mother to hear. He was almost falling off the couch. Alice and Emmett were in much the same predicament, and I just rolled my eyes at them. He did what? My mother demanded in a too quiet voice that I was afraid did not bode well for anyone. He asked me to marry him, and I just panicked, I repeated, making Edward laugh so much harder he rolled off the couch and onto the floor. Is it that serious already? She asked, her tone remaining quiet. Well, I didn't know what to tell her. I do love him, Mom. I just don't know that I'm old enough to be engaged. Well, Bella, you know what's right for you. You're not like I was at that age. You've always been so much more mature than I was, she said gently, almost soothingly. Is there ever going to be anyone else for you? I gaped in silence at the phone in my hand for a moment before I gained control of myself to answer her. Well, no, I gave her the serious answer. She deserved the absolute truth. There will never be anyone else for me, ever. Then, what is there to worry about? My unpredictable mother advised me. I do want to meet this boy, though. I also want you to wait for the wedding until after you graduate from high school. Finish school first. All right, Mom. I was stunned. This was not the reaction I was expecting from my mother. And I expect to see you both here in Jacksonville when school lets out. I want to meet this boy, and you haven't been to the new house yet, my mother said with almost faultless Renee logic. I was still gaping at her reaction. Edward was suddenly there behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, and he pulled me into the circle of his arms. I calmed a little at his touch. We'd work it out, somehow. We'll have to see, I tried to say, but my mother was already moving on. You promised me about waiting until after graduation, right, Bella? She was insisting. At first I just nodded, and then I realized that she couldn't hear me nod. Yeah, okay, Mom. Then it occurred to me. Where had she been? Mom, where are you? Me? Now she sounded sheepish. I'm in Cancun. I rolled my eyes. I should have expected something like this when no one could reach her. Why are you in Cancun, Mom? Well, we had a little time before school started, and Phil and I thought we'd have a second honeymoon of sorts. I didn't know you were going to need me. She started sounding defensive, and I yelled not to laugh. No, don't worry about it, Mom. I'm just fine, honestly. You finish your honeymoon with Phil and have a good time. We said our goodbyes, and then Edward took the phone from my hand and hung it up. He tossed it over onto the couch next to Asme and turned me around to look at him. I blinked several times before I could speak. I did not expect this reaction from my mother at a possible engagement. What just happened? I was hoping he could tell me because I still felt lost. You're engaged, Bella. Alice jumped up over to us and announced with far too much glee. I stared back at her, and then my eyes narrowed. No, I'm not, Alice. Edward never asked me. He said we could use the excuse that he'd asked me to marry him to explain things to my father. I corrected her savagely. Well, I had planned on asking you after the baseball game, Edward said very softly. My head whipped around to fix him in my gaze. What? I was stunned again. Still, I didn't like this feeling of being off balance. Edward just got down one knee, pulling a box out of his pocket and holding it up to me. I've waited for you for more years than I care to count, Bella, he said from his position on the floor at my feet. There will never be anyone else for me either. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? He opened the box and revealed a ring. The ring. I blinked at it, too stunned to know how to react. I stared down into his face. He was serious. I dropped onto the couch beside Esme where we'd been sitting together only minutes earlier. He followed me. Still kneeling, he looked nervous suddenly, closing the box again. We can talk about it later if you like, he said as he moved to put the box away again. And I stopped him with a soft touch to the hand holding the box. You've been planning that, I said softly, watching his expression carefully as he nodded. We'll talk about it later. I gave him confirmation that he wasn't getting any answers immediately. To make up for my lack of a response, I leaned over and kissed him softly, then drew him to his feet as I rose. Right now, I need to hunt, and then I have to track down my father. He's going to ground me for life. At the moment, I could handle the reality of the mundane things in my life better than I could the thought of getting married. That was something that could wait for another time. Right now, my life was perfect, and I saw no need to change that immediately. I had Edward, we were both vampires, and able to be together. I could hold his hand without having to worry about hurting or killing him. I had an entire vampire family that accepted me, wanted me, and helped me take care of anything that needed taking care of. I had parents that loved me and supported me, no matter what happened. I knew Charlie wasn't going to let me get away with taking off like I did, and he'd likely be unbearably rude to Edward. But even still, I couldn't imagine life being any better than this. We left the Cullen house right away to go hunting. I hadn't been hunting since the night before we'd left for Phoenix, and I was sorely in need. My eyes were starting to change with my diet, and as the red faded, they would edge into the black zone with thirst. Edward was especially careful with me this time, leading me deep into the mountains before suggesting that I let loose. I let him because I didn't want to slip, and he was able to scan the area for human minds when we couldn't utterly rely on our other senses. I was able to find a bear just coming out of hibernation, which was Emmett's favorite apparently. I took it down fast and hard, holding it to the ground as I sucked it dry of blood. I had been learning and was a much more careful eater now than I had been the first few times Edward and I had been hunting, so I didn't get anything on Alice's blue outfit. One bear wasn't enough for as hungry as I was, however, and I brought down several deer in addition to the bear before I was sated enough to head back toward Forks. Edward hunted when I did, so we were both feeling good when we came across a familiar scent in the mountains as we neared home. We stopped in a nearby clearing, and Edward was still for a moment before he turned to me to explain. The wolves noticed you were gone. Apparently Charlie has been quite upset, he explained softly. They could smell that you were back and have sent an emissary. I blinked in surprise and then turned to follow the sound as I heard the movement. I was shocked when it was none other than Jacob Black who came out into the clearing. He was wearing only a pair of cut-off sweats and a bit of string looped around his ankle several times. I smiled in welcome and took a step forward before I stopped. I didn't know if Jacob even wanted to be friends with me anymore, and I stepped back again, closer to Edward. "Hello, Jacob," I greeted him with a friendly smile. A girl could hope that her childhood friend wasn't just going to hate her because of some silly vampire werewolf thing. Not that I remembered much about that childhood friendship, but I thought we had become friends since I had come to live in Forks. Jacob stood there looking at me for several long moments before he glanced at Edward and then back at me. He sighed after a long moment, shaking his head. "Part of me was hoping it wasn't true," he finally said. "That what wasn't true?" I was trying not to read anything into his reaction, but so far this didn't bode well. Jacob tilted his head to look at me. I knew this habit well, but the look on his face was cold, unwelcoming, like the one Sam Yulee had been wearing when he demanded to know if the treaty had been broken. "You've known all along, huh, Bells?" Jacob demanded quietly, and I noticed his hands had begun to shake. "Jacob, I didn't, not at first. That first night you guys came to the house after I moved here, Billy noticed the change in me and the pack, and your dad met with us that night. I didn't know before then that any of this might involve you, and your father made it clear that I couldn't tell you anything. I tried to make it right, but didn't think anything I said was going to help. So it's true, what Sam showed me." I glanced at Edward, not sure what Jacob meant. Edward had his arm wrapped tightly around my waist. It looked like he wasn't sure Jacob wasn't going to attack. "They share memories, thoughts really, in the pack," Edward explained to me softly, earning a sharp look from Jacob. "Sam showed him the meeting with the pack, and Billy when you explained how you were attacked." It made more sense now, though Jacob stared at Edward in shock. Edward can read minds, Alice sees the future, and I seem to be a brick wall for things like mind reading and tracking and stuff like that. I told Jacob, kinda glad now that I could share things with him. "Yes, we'd heard that you bloodsuckers sometimes had special powers." Jacob's words were almost an attack, given his biting tone. I winced and turned to cuddle into Edward more closely, which prompted Jacob to growl softly. He hated me now. I was the enemy. Why should he care if my boyfriend was holding me? I glanced up again, and Jacob seemed to be having a hard time controlling the shaking that seemed to echo all over his body. After several minutes, he finally looked at me again. "You disappeared again, Bella," he said softly. I thought the point was to spare Charlie all this stress and pain. "He came back for me," I said softly. I worried for a moment if that might set him off again. I left to protect Charlie from the vampire that created me. I was right. The shaking started again. Only more violently this time, and Edward tugged me several steps back. At the sight of us moving away, Jacob took several deep breaths, struggling to calm down. "The vampire who created you came back. Back for what, Bella?" Jacob wanted clarification. For me, Jacob, he intended to use Charlie as bait to lure me to him. He wanted to kill me. It was a sort of game to him. I watched Jacob carefully, ready to spring away if it was needed. "Wanted?" Jacob keyed in on that particular word and its meaning, and I nodded in confirmation. "He's dead now. We lured him away and killed him. It was a short version, but I didn't want to go into all the details. The end result was the same. James was dead." Hearing the threat was over seemed to help Jacob calm somewhat, and he glanced at Edward before he looked at me again. "He's dead?" "Yep." I tried to turn things a bit lighter. Ashes burned a whole building down around him to make sure there was nothing at all remaining. "When was this?" Jacob kept glancing at Edward. I finally looked back up at him to see if I could figure out why, but he looked the same to me, so I looked back at Jacob again. "A couple of days ago, we just got back." "I did not use Bella as bait," Edward snarled suddenly, his tone fierce and angry. I looked up at him in surprise and then back at Jacob and rolled my eyes. "Jacob," I admonished softly, "you've known me since we were babies. Have I ever needed help in drawing out the biggest disaster imaginable?" Edward and his family went after James, while I was supposed to be safe in hiding. "She snuck out," Edward clarified to Jacob after a pause, in which I figured he was reading Jacob's mind, and I sighed. Jacob's black eyes returned to me again, and suddenly he started laughing. "That's great, Bella. An entire clan of bloodsuckers, and even they can't keep you in line and out of trouble. Jacob would find that extremely amusing." I didn't. "Hey, it's not like I go out looking for disasters, you know. They come to me," I insisted, irritated that they were ganging up on me now. "Yeah, so you're safe now?" Jacob wondered, seeming more like the boy I knew now that he wasn't being so dour. Maybe, I shrugged. He had a mate. A red-headed woman. We don't know what she'll do. Jacob assessed, and then shrugged and took a step back. The pack needs to know what is up. It seems that you did the best that you could. I wish you'd have let us in on it, though. I wouldn't have minded killing some bloodsuckers. Jacob paused while he stared at my face. Wow, Bells, that's really freaky. How do you hide the evil eyes from Charlie? Colored contacts, and they're not evil. At least, not as much as they were. They're fading more every day. I stuck my tongue out at the mouthy werewolf. He grinned back at me. You're going back to Charlie's? I nodded, letting him know that I wasn't going to leave my father hanging. My dad insists that we come by when you get back. I guess we're still babysitting you. I thought we were just hanging. He seemed less hostile about the situation now. With you, Jacob. We were just hanging no matter what your father's agenda was, I told him with a smile. You going to be all right with that? The rest of the pack seemed to hate being around us. I'm really not going to hurt Charlie. You don't need to babysit me. Jacob shrugged. For a little while, Bella, let us keep an eye on you. It makes the elders happy, and they'll come to trust you in time, he reassured me. I blinked in surprise, staring at him for a moment, and then I smiled just a bit. Does that mean we're okay? You don't hate me now? I asked for clarification. I didn't want any misunderstandings. I'll try, Bella, but to be honest, you stink. He reached up to rub at his nose, and I gaped at him. I stink? You're the one that smells. It positively burns my nose. I threw back at him with a smirk. Yeah, you say that to make yourself feel better about it, Bella, he teased back with a smile. And I knew that, for the most part, our friendship was going to be just fine. Just do me a favor and shower before Billy drags you over, Jake. I smirked and then took Edward's hand as Jacob backed into the trees. Yeah, I'll try to remember that. He waved as he moved further under the trees, turning to go. Things weren't perfect between us. We were still vampires and werewolves to a degree. But I'd known Jacob for a long time, and I thought that this was something that we could eventually get around. Sure, Jake. Just don't be surprised if I dump a bucket of water over your head, I yelled once he was out of sight. Wait, then you'd smell like wet dog. His response was a laugh echoing through the forest. Edward then tugged on my hand to get my attention, smiling at me. That went better than you thought it would? He asked as we started running, heading back to his house to pick up my truck. I nodded with a smile. Jacob was talking to me and laughing at things instead of growling and trying to kill me. This was more than I had dared hope once I knew that he was going to become a werewolf. He doesn't seem to hate me just because I'm a vampire and he's a werewolf. That possibility worried me a little, I admitted, and then smiled at him as we ran. We neared the house, and I looked down at myself again inside, brushing at the skirt I was still wearing. We'd driven so hard, so fast, that I hadn't taken the time to change, and I needed to hunt more than anything else once we'd arrived back in Forks. I can finally get out of this skirt, I said happily as we got to the house and ducked into the garage for my bag that Alice had stashed in the back of the Mercedes. I like the skirt. The words Edward used were simple, but the tone was fervent, worshipful. I looked up at him and laughed at the look on his face. His eyes were on my legs, his focus absolute. Why, Edward Cullen, do you have something to say about my wardrobe? He blinked up at my face in surprise, warned by the tone of my voice. No, Bella, he said carefully. I'm just saying that when you feel like dressing up a little, you look incredible. I grabbed my bag out of the trunk and walked over to stand in front of him, my eyes meeting his as I leaned in close enough to kiss him, but just breathed on him. Is Alice right, Edward? I breathed against his lips. Usually. What about this time? Every once in a while, I dazzled him like he always did me, and I loved it. This was one of those times that you older men like a girl in a dress. Do you have a thing for me in a skirt, Edward? I asked, my tone soft and smooth. On, was his response as he tried to lean in further to kiss me. This was a new thing. I wasn't usually able to get Edward all muddled. I guess that was my answer, considering that he couldn't really say anything coherent. I laughed and spun on my toes, walking past him and out the door. I'm going to go change, I informed him as I walked away. Change? Edward followed me out of the garage, still in a daze. You don't have to change. You look breathtaking. Exactly, Edward, I said as I walked toward one of the bathrooms in the house. If I come home like this, Charlie will think we took off for some spring break fun. Do you really want Charlie to think you and I were off playing somewhere while he worried about me? I turned to give him a pointed look. As I went to close the bathroom door, He was right behind me, still dazzled. He looked confused at why I should shut him out, and I pushed back several steps so I could close the door. Think about it, Edward. I called through the door as I changed and came out a moment later. Edward was still standing directly outside the door, but he seemed to have shaken off most of the days I'd left him in. He smiled at me as I emerged, and he shook his head slightly. I paused listening to the house. It was absolutely silent. Everyone else must have gone out to hunt while we were gone. If you'd intended on changing into something that would help me clear my head, that isn't going to do it, Bella, he teased at my wearing my usual jeans and a t-shirt. You're just saying that to make me feel better about my casual wardrobe, I said with a smile as I slung my bag over my shoulder and went hunting down the keys to my truck. I wandered into the main living area and sat down sideways on the piano bench. The keys to my truck were sitting carefully propped up on a sheet of music. I picked them up and turned to look at Edward as he joined me. Okay, how is this going to play out? Why did I decide it was safe to come back? I wasn't good at this plotting to lie thing, and figured it would be best if we all got our stories straight. Edward pulled the box back out of his pocket and turned it around in his hand, though he didn't open it again. He looked down at it and then back up at me, warily, as though he expected me to freak out again. I blinked at it like it was about to grow two heads. You could tell him I tracked you down and talked you into coming back, he said gently. Carlisle was with me, of course, to ensure that everything was most proper. The box was turned around again in his hand, his fingers caressing the short velvet nap on the top of the box. It looked antique, as though he'd had it for some time. And my eyes fixed on it, and after a moment, I reached out and plucked the box from his hand. He twitched, startled, as it disappeared. I opened the box this time and looked down at the ring sitting so innocently inside. The face was a long oval set with slanting rows of glittering round stones set in a web of delicate gold lattice. Tell me that you didn't spend a lot of money on this, I demanded breathlessly. I didn't spend anything on it, Bella, he said softly as he slid onto the bench next to me as if he were about to start playing, though his fingers only brushed the top of a couple of keys. That is the ring my father gave to my mother. I glanced back down at the ring in my hand in surprise and touched the top stones. His mother's ring. He'd saved it all this time, just for me. I swallowed carefully. You really are serious about this marriage thing, aren't you? I whispered softly, still staring at the ring. What are you thinking, Bella? It's killing me. Not knowing, he said softly. Little strands of stress filtering through his voice, though he was trying to be nonchalant. This was very important to him. Why is it such a big deal? We've talked about forever. You're going to laugh? I said softly, my finger brushing over the ring again. It was breathtaking. I promise I won't. I need to know. It's just, I'm not that girl. I looked up to meet his eyes. The one that gets married right out of high school. Everyone is going to think that we had to get married. Does it really matter what anyone else thinks, Bella? He countered softly. We're going to be together anyway. Besides, I was that boy. If I had met you then, I'd have courted you carefully and asked you to marry me as soon as I could. I was a man, even then, just waiting for the time when I was old enough that I could go off to war. It wasn't that big of a deal to get married so young. In fact, it was expected. I tried to think about it as I thought he did. I tried to imagine the two of us together when he had really been 17. My mind produced a glorious white dress that I would have worn to marry him. It echoed of Anne of Avila, a delicate wax crown over the veil on my head. It would match this ring perfectly. My eyes returned to him. He was watching me carefully, not sure what I was going to do at this point. My mind skimmed over so many of the things he had said and done, and I suddenly realized something. I smiled slowly, the gesture prompting Edward to shift nervously on the bench. This is why you're so careful about kissing me. My fingers brushed the ring again. It wasn't proper to get too involved with a woman before the wedding. You want a traditional wedding night. Edward shifted on the bench again, clearing his throat nervously. It was a long moment of silence before he answered. There is so much that I've done in my life, Bella, he finally said softly. This is the one thing that I have left. All the other commandments I've broken. But this one I want to do right. I watched his face carefully as he spoke, and I think I was interpreting between the lines pretty accurately. He was talking about his soul, about the years he was away from Carlisle, and about the things he'd had to do to protect himself or his family. I knew he hadn't been with anyone else that way. As I hadn't, we both would be the other's first and last. There would never be anyone else for me. This was one thing I could give him, something only I could give him. Most of the fears I had about marrying young were about my parents' reactions. I had thought my mother was going to freak out worse than she did when I'd gone missing. She'd always made such a big deal about marrying young when I was a child, about how much of a mistake it had been. She hadn't done what I'd expected, though. In fact, it seemed my mother had almost expected it. My father was going to go off the deep end on me, no matter what happened at this point. I turned the box around in my hand several times, the pad of my thumb brushing the top again and again. Edward was watching me so very carefully, trying to hide the nervous look on his face. He looked so on edge, as though he expected me to throw the ring at him and take off running. "I do want to marry you," I finally said softly, looking into the face that I adored so deeply. "I guess it's just the timing that I have issues with." Edward flinched before composing himself and reaching for my free hand, threading his fingers through mine. "Bella, does the timing matter so much? We are both outside of time at this point. It means so very little anymore." He pulled my hand up to his lips and he brushed kisses along the back of my fingers, delicately as was his habit to do. "I will marry you, Edward, and I will be with you forever. But don't you think this is a little much right now? I mean, I'm only a junior in high school." I threw out another of my reasons. "He might be over 100 years old, but I was still just 17. "Is it, Bella? Are you anything like your usual junior in high school? You yourself say that your mother teases you about being born middle-aged and becoming a vampire has separated you that much more from your peers." He was far too reasonable, dealing with all my irrational fears and issues with cold, hard logic. Besides, it is something that will make sense to Charlie. It is reasonable for you to panic at the thought of getting married. In fact, you did precisely that when you thought it was just a cover story. It also explains why you would come home. If I found you and talked you into marrying me, you'd no longer have a reason to stay away. I watched him carefully, suspiciously. I had a feeling that he'd say almost anything he had to in order to get me to agree to this. I was being carefully manipulated, and he was more than aware that I knew what he was doing. "You will do almost anything to get your way in this, won't you, Edward?" I said suspiciously. I wasn't going to allow deception between us, especially something as important as this. "Almost anything, Bella," he admitted, with that crooked smile that I so loved. I looked back down at the ring again and took it gingerly out of its satin bed, turning it around in my fingers to look at it. "It's beautiful, Edward. It really is." I put it back into the box carefully and handed it back to him, still open. "But," he prompted carefully, still waiting for my answer. I still wasn't sure how to answer him. I knew there was no one else for either of us. We would eventually be married. I just wasn't sure that I wanted to do this now. He did have a point, though. This was something Charlie would understand. But I didn't want to do this for Charlie. If I was going to be engaged to Edward, it would be because I adored him more than life, a life that I wanted to share with him and only with him. "We can wait a few years to get married, though, right?" I finally said, looking down at the keyboard on the piano as I brushed my fingertips over the top of a couple of the keys, mirroring Edward's earlier gesture. Edward was up off the bench in the next breath, pulling me to my feet. He grabbed me in his arms and held me so tightly that if I'd been human, I wouldn't have been able to breathe.
"Is that a yes, Bella?"
He whispered into my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "Conditionally," I squeaked out as he spun me around again. A moment later, he lifted and turned me until my back was against the keys and was on one knee in front of me on the floor. "What are these conditions?" he asked seriously, looking up into my face. "We wait a few years. I'm going to have to leave Charlie soon enough. Let's not do it too soon." This was the most important factor to me. "We can work out the timing later," he said as he pulled the ring from its safe place in the box and slid it onto the ring finger on my left hand. He sighed in delight as it slid right into place, a perfect fit. I blinked at the sudden weight. He'd done it too quickly for the human eye, and I could read the delight in his expression, the satisfaction on his face. I was being claimed, though in my heart I was already his. He wanted everyone else to know that we belonged to each other. I glanced at my hand again, at the ring that felt so heavy, despite being so very delicate. I felt the weight of its symbolism more than the object. This tied me to Edward almost completely. This ring was a part of him, part of his history, his human family. He wanted me to have it, to be a part of his new family, his history, his future. In a way, by wearing his mother's ring, I claimed him as completely as he was claiming me. That part was fine with me. I wanted all the giggling little girls to understand that Edward Cullen was mine. Edward was radiating smug satisfaction, and I couldn't help but laugh at his expression, curling my hand into a fist, holding the ring to me as I tried to become accustomed to the feel of it. So the fact that Mike Newton and his cronies won't be able to miss this isn't a factor at all, right, Edward? I teased him with some amusement. He looked up at me, and his smile turned sheepish. Well, it certainly doesn't hurt. He rose to his feet and tugged on my hand, drawing me up so that I stood before him. He bent his head down, hands on my cheeks, and his breath was warm and sweet on my face. But this isn't for Mike or Charlie or anyone else, Bella. He breathed against my lips. I was dazzled again. This is about you and me and our life together. That's what's important to me, my love. I breathed back at him, too dazzled to speak, as I leaned toward him for my kiss. He'd better give me a kiss at this point. I just agreed to marry him. He leaned in just a bit more, and I got my wish, Edward's lips on mine. They were fervent this time, as he so rarely allowed, and I melted into his embrace. There was a deliberate noise on the stairs which I ignored while savoring the feel of Edward's lips on mine. He sighed, drawing back much too quickly, and looked up behind him to look at the person waiting there. His forehead dropped back to settle against mine as my eyes opened and the crooked smile returned to his lips. He wasn't any happier than I was about having our kiss interrupted, and I glanced around him to see who had prompted him to be willing to draw apart from me. Rosalie stood there on the bottom step, looking at him expectantly. Another sigh escaped his lips, and I assumed that she was talking to him silently. I hated when people did that. It felt like they were deliberately trying to hide things from me. As far as I was concerned, the ring on my finger meant that there was nothing that affected Edward that wasn't my business, and I looked up at Rosalie pointedly. I waited. Edward was the one that answered my look. However, drawing back from me slightly. I glanced at him in surprise, but he was looking at Rosalie. Don't take too long, Rose. Charlie's still expecting us, and he's sure to be worried sick. Edward informed her a bit irascibly. I'm going to go find Carlisle. Edward's attention returned to me briefly. You did want him to come with us to see your father, right? How well he knew me. I nodded and watched as he walked out the back door and took off into the forest. Carlisle and Esme must have gone on a short hunt. My attention was drawn back into the room as Rosie stepped down the last step and walked over to join me. I watched her curiously. Usually, she went out of her way to avoid me, and when she did have to be in my presence, there was a perpetually irritated look on her face. Rosalie moved just past me, and then gestured to the smaller seating area inside the large living room. At this point, I was too curious to tell her what to do with herself, and quietly walked over to sink into a comfortable overstuffed armchair. I pulled my legs up underneath me while I watched her settle elegantly on the seat nearest me. I wanted to apologize to you, Bella, for the way that I've been acting, Rosalie said to me quietly, looking at me directly like she actually meant it. I almost fell out of my chair. I was so startled that it actually took me a moment to process the fact that she was serious. I must have been gaping at her like a fish for several seconds before I pulled myself together. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say to that, but it explained why Edward was actually willing to give us a few moments alone. Thank you for telling me, Rosie, but I have to admit to being curious. Why the change of heart? I've never really hated you, Bella, just what you represent. The constant threat to my family. Then, when you had to leave town so quickly, my husband was dragged into the hunting group that was supposed to find and kill that vampire. She looked down at her hands, and I could see she was trying to hide the shame in her eyes. It was very hard for me to watch my husband go off to risk his life, defending someone who isn't even a member of our family, she admitted softly. I never asked him to do that, Rosie, I reminded her gently. I know, and he'd have gone anyway. Emmett does not miss a fight because I'm worried about him. He tells me I'm crazy and goes anyway. Her smile was wry as she looked back up at me again. Alice called us from the airport in Phoenix after you took off. She told us what you had done. I couldn't be mad at you anymore. I understood why you'd done it. That surprised me, and I am sure she could see it on my face. She smiled at me again, and then leaned slightly forward. See, I don't think you were thinking too much about protecting yourself at that point, am I right? You thought your mom was in trouble, and you went off on your own to take care of it. That was just what I would do if something like that had happened to anyone in my family. I didn't think you had it in you to do what needed to be done, even if you'd have to sacrifice yourself to do it. I must have gaped at her again. Did this woman know anything about me? How could she not notice that everything I had done since becoming a vampire had all been about everyone else? I know, she said suddenly, looking guilty as she threw her hands up in the air with more animation than I'd ever seen in her. Emmett said, I was stupid not to see it before, but I felt like I had done you a disservice, so I wanted to apologize. Just then, the back door opened, and Edward brought Carlisle and Esme in from outside, interrupting a conversation that was sure to only get more awkward. Edward took one look at me and walked over to take my hand, drawing me into his embrace. Rosalie stood, tolerating the awkward moment only briefly before stepping back, more than willing to fade into the background at this point. Thanks for letting me talk to you, Bella. I'm going to go find Emmett now. Then Rosalie is gone, and I could not help but release a sigh of relief. Edward laughed at my reaction and hugged me to him tightly. Sorry for leaving you alone, love, but she was desperate to make good, especially now that she can't say you aren't a member of the family anymore, he said softly into my ear. Esme gasped behind us, and I tipped my head to see what she was so excited about. Her eyes were on the ring on my hand. She was nearly vibrating in her delight, and I laughed, shaking my head. At that moment, her reaction was exactly the reception expected from Alice. Don't get too excited, Esme. I have to graduate from high school first. I lifted my head to look at Edward. But before that, I have to go home to Charlie. It isn't going to be easy to tell him about this. Remind me to make sure he doesn't have easy access to his gun. Edward laughed at that, shaking his head. He can't hurt me, love. Yeah, but I don't want to explain to him why you're faster than a speeding bullet. I looked around him to smile at Carlisle. It is much less likely to get violent if you come with us, Carlisle. If you don't mind, I would have begged if I needed to, but Carlisle chuckled slightly and nodded. Alice warned us that you might need a bit of a buffer. I don't mind at all. His smile was just as wide as Esme's. She was still grinning widely as she waved goodbye from the front porch. I felt a shiver go down my spine as I thought about what was coming. It was time to face Charlie. Carlisle followed us in his Mercedes back to Charlie's house. Edward and I were in my truck as it thundered down the street, announcing to all far and near that I was on my way. When I pulled up in front of the house and got out, Charlie was waiting for us on the front porch. Charlie's expression was suspicious when he saw that Edward was with me. I waited at the corner of the front fender of my truck for Edward and Carlisle to join me. Edward took my hand as Carlisle led our small group up the steps to meet my father at the door. I was more than willing to let Carlisle shield me from Charlie's anger for the moment. Charlie took one long look at the three of us. He nodded at Carlisle, and the two greeted each other as equals, shaking hands and exchanging greetings before he opened the door and politely invited Carlisle inside. Edward and I got the stern wave to get our butts inside. I slid past Charlie, dragging Edward with me. Carlisle joined us on the couch as Charlie dropped down into his favorite chair. Carlisle leaned back on the couch comfortably, and I knew by the look in his eye that he was enjoying our little drama. While Charlie was distracted with getting settled, Carlisle's eyes moved around the room, noticing the pictures I still hadn't been able to talk my dad into taking down. He smiled at how gawky and awkward I looked in all of them. I reached around with my foot, and, in a move as fast as lightning, kicked his foot. My message was clear: no staring and giggling at the terrible adolescent Bella pictures. Just in time, we were all looking innocent again, as Charlie looked up at us, taking in our positions. I sat in the middle on the couch, Edward to one side of me, and Carlisle on the other. Edward had my hand nearest him captured, and his fingers threaded through mine. I knew Charlie was seeing our relationship as he hadn't allowed himself to see before. He was observing just how close we seemed to be. All right, Bella. Charlie started as he watched Edward and me. Want to explain this all to me? I panicked, I said, as though I was admitting something uncomfortable, using the explanation that Edward had given me. Why? Charlie's tone was far too knowing, too sure. At that point I knew. My mother had already gotten to him and given him the rundown. It just didn't seem real, I said quietly, looking down at my feet. Edward wanting me to marry him. It was just too good to be true. My eyes lifted to meet Edward's, and he smiled at me reassuringly. The reasons I could give Charlie were ones that did worry me. These things did make it hard for me to just agree to believe that Edward really did want me, but I'd gotten over them some months before. Edward worked hard to show me that he adored me in every way that I would allow. I mean, look at him, I gestured with my hand as I looked at my father. He's intelligent, far too attractive than any man has a right to be. Self-sacrificing, kind, More than I can even put to words, but he says he wants to spend his life with me. I find it very difficult to accept. I smiled into Edward's face as I saw him fight, not to reject everything I said and provide all the reasons why I was so much more interesting, intelligent, wonderful, etc. than he was. I just laughed at the look on his face and reached up to cover his mouth so he couldn't throw in at this point. He started leaving kisses on my fingers where they were covering his mouth, and I dropped it again, turning to see Charlie's disapproving glare. After I brought Bella home, I went home to explain to my family what happened. I gave her a cell phone some months ago for emergencies, and so I called her after a few hours later to make sure she was all right. I found that she had taken off and was driving to Phoenix. Carlisle and I went right after her. Of course, we finally caught up with her after she had arrived in Phoenix, Edward supplied, continuing his part of the story. We found a hotel near her mother's house, Carlisle confirmed in a quiet voice. I knew he found this far too amusing. Charlie was nearly frothing at the mouth until Carlisle said something. He seemed to calm down a little when he was told that we had been supervised by a parent. He still wasn't happy, though. It took some time to convince her to even talk to me, Edward continued. I was glad he had, since I didn't know how to explain this part. And even longer to convince her I was sincere. You know how stubborn she is, sir. Charlie had to nod at that. If there were awards for sheer stubbornness, I would probably have won a few. Edward's hand brushed over the ring on my finger, feeling it against my skin. You wouldn't know it to look at him, but he was radiating immense satisfaction that I was wearing his mother's ring. I knew him so well, I could feel it. Once I had convinced her that I was serious, but that we didn't need to make any decisions now, we returned immediately. I am sincere, Chief Swan. I know we're still young, but how we feel about each other will not change in the next year. Bella has agreed to be my wife after we graduate. We would like your blessing. I let Edward play the good guy here. It would help Charlie to accept him again if Edward was being protective of me, but I rolled my eyes. Sure, I said, using one of Jacob's phrases that had always made me laugh. Carlisle was trying his best to look stoic and parental. It almost made me want to laugh. But Charlie was genuinely upset. While the three of us were perpetrating an elaborate act to keep all the humans safe, especially my father, I still felt like a fraud. So what, now you're engaged? Charlie demanded with a hint of disgust laced with strain in his voice. Technically, I hedged. I may have gotten off easy with Renee, but Charlie was not going to give any quarter here. It will be a long engagement, I tried to sound soothing. We're not in a hurry to rush into anything. In a big enough hurry to get engaged at 17, Charlie muttered under his breath in a tone that I wouldn't have been able to hear so clearly had I been human. He kept sending Edward dirty looks, and I could see his eyes dart toward the peg in the kitchen where he hung his gun. When off duty, he couldn't be seriously thinking about shooting the love of my life, could he? Dad, I didn't try to hide the warning in my tone. Stop it. Edward isn't at fault here for my taking off. That was all me. Not only that, you've been cold and mean to him from day one, and that's gotta stop. He's not leaving. Edward is the one I want, and you're going to have to learn to deal with him being around. He continued to glare at Edward, and I could see that he was contemplating ways he could attempt to scare Edward away when I mentioned it. The noise of derision that escaped from Charlie's lips set off something in me. Suddenly I was done with all of it. Everyone else had been getting their way for months, pushing me around like a beach ball floating on the waves. James had decided I'd be more fun to hunt, as a vampire. I had to move to Forks just to be able to live more like a normal human to keep the secret from my parents. Alice wanted to dress me up like a doll. James had wanted to get me away from my vampire family so that he could try to kill me. Edward wanted to marry me, to stake his claim, to keep me forever. Charlie wanted Edward to go away. This was where I drew the line. I was done just sitting back and letting everyone else have what they wanted to the detriment of my own desires. This one, Charlie wasn't going to win. Being apart from Edward would hurt more than Charlie's human mind could probably even comprehend, and I would not allow it, not even for my father. In this case, I was going to insist on my own happiness. I wasn't giving him up. Edward's only warning that I was about to go even the slightest newborn was a tightening of my hands on his. His hands tightened back around my own, urging restraint, reminding me that control was important to me. That's enough. It slipped out from my lips before I could censor it. Carlisle stiffened beside me as though to help Edward if I had to be restrained from attacking. The lack of faith from either side of me only caused a deeper reaction, and I growled under my breath in a sound too soft for human ears. A warning. I'll be 18 in a few months, Dad. If you can't come to terms with Edward being a part of my life and treat him with the respect due another human being who has done nothing to hurt you, then I will have to find someplace else to live. Anger laced my tone, and I didn't try to rein it in. I was serious in a way I don't think the rest of them understood to what depths. In fact, I think I'll move in with Edward's family earlier than we'd planned. I watched the shock and anger on my father's face as he realized what I meant. He did not want me living in the same house as my boyfriend. Edward and Carlisle started in surprise. My retaliation was verbal instead of physical. Threats instead of attacks. Edward's surprise was more than that. However, he'd willingly take me in and let me live with them. But he was also grateful for the barrier Charlie created that kept both of us innocent until we'd said the vows he was so looking forward to. I watched my father instead of the two men beside me. They'd support me, but Charlie was still a wild card. My father was getting that look on his face that I knew mirrored mine. The stubborn one that did not bode well since it meant we were about to go head to head. It didn't happen often, but it was epic when it did. Edward and Carlisle were about to get a lesson in just exactly where I got some of my more unique traits. Charlie changed tactics. I'd expected that, and I waited for his volley. He turned to Carlisle. "Carlisle, you can't support this," Charlie thrust out, trying to gather Edward's adoptive father into agreeing with him. But I knew something Charlie didn't. Carlisle was still worried about me living with Charlie and would actually be happier if I lived with them and just visited with my dad. Carlisle's tone was apologetic, like he wanted to agree with Charlie, but just couldn't bring himself to give in. "We have discussed that Edward and Bella would live with us after their wedding, like the other children will. I have to say that if she feels like she has to leave your home, I would rather that she be with us than off on her own or homeless." I could almost sense Charlie deflating just a bit, but recalculating another maneuver if this one died altogether. "I would rather have them living with us, where we can still ensure some distance in their relationship, than to have them take off together. That is another option that I wouldn't put past them if Bella no longer felt at home here." "Charlie," Carlisle threw out the one thing that would immediately take the wind out of my father's sails. I nearly laughed at that. Edward's family wouldn't care if we took off together. He wasn't a child. He was old enough to be Charlie's grandfather, and well knew how to handle himself, even if I was simply a 17-year-old girl. Edward also had more money at hand than I was even aware of. I always tried not to think about just how rich the Cullens were. We could literally disappear for months or years on end, checking in with the rest of the Cullens periodically, and they wouldn't think anything of it other than that they might miss us. We could, quite literally, travel the world. But Carlisle knew that I wanted to be here. I wanted to spend the time that I had with my parents. I only had about a decade at most before I would most likely have to disappear altogether to keep the secret, and that decade meant a lot to me to be able to be available to my parents. Carlisle was trying to help my real goal along, but Carlisle also knew that Edward was my mate in the way that vampires measure that soul-deep connection. Edward was literally the other half of me, the way Asmi was for him. There was no Bella without Edward. I'd leave my parents behind if I had to in order to be with Edward and keep him safe. In the end, I would have to leave my parents eventually, but I was never leaving Edward, ever. Charlie gave Carlisle a look of disappointment in what he must have seen as a betrayal of the parental code, and he deflated just a bit more. Carlisle was only echoing things that Charlie would want. He would want me safe and nearby where someone he trusted could keep an eye on me. He was starting to reassess what he wanted from this meeting. Was Charlie more concerned with putting some distance between Edward and me, or was he more concerned with keeping me safe and close enough that he could dictate the depth of our relationship, at least for a little while longer? I knew which desire would win. I had no question of it. It was just getting Charlie there in my own way, letting him think it was completely his own idea. In the end, Charlie wanted the time with me that he felt he'd lost when Renee had taken me and run. He had enjoyed this time that we lived together, the meals that we spent talking about various things. He loved playing the part of concerned father, trying to protect me and doing battle with my boyfriend about how much was allowed. He was doing father things for the first time since I was a baby. Renee and I hadn't given Charlie much chance to really be my father, and it seemed to mean a lot to him to do it now. In a way, Charlie was fighting against time to keep me as his little girl just a little while longer. Little did he know, I hoped he would never know, a sadistic vampire had taken the last bit of girlish innocence away from me in the Arizona desert. It had happened before I'd even come to live here with him. I was playing at the role for Charlie to make him happy, at least for now, but he had to play fair. There were things I was not giving up. My anger melted away at the sad look deep in my father's eyes. I was suddenly back to being the beach ball being pushed around on the waves. Dad, I don't want to move out, but Edward isn't leaving. You're just going to have to get used to the fact that he's going to be around, and we're going to be together. But we want to do this in the right way for us. I gave him a little smile, letting him know that everything was still good between us. I promised Mom that I wouldn't get married until after graduation, so you don't have to worry about anything until at least then. I squeezed Edward's hand to let him know I was still okay. I even agree that you should ground me. I deserve it for taking off like I did. Charlie looked down at the way my hands were linked with Edward's. I knew he saw how we touched each other in some small way, almost constantly, the way I'd noticed that Carlisle and Esme did. He sighed after a long moment of silence, and I could see the moment where he decided to back down. Fine, Charlie gave in reluctantly. I'll be nice and you won't take off suddenly again. And no eloping. Give me some warning, please. Bella, as far as being grounded, you better believe that you are. I can't believe you took off like that again, Bells. You know what it did to your mother and me the last time. I knew the moment that he started calling me Bells that everything would be all right, that he forgave me, even if he wanted to continue to torment me for a little while longer. No more camping, though. Not while you're grounded, he tried to sound stern, but he didn't fool me. This was another way to create distance between Edward and me. Now, Charlie, Carlisle cleared his throat as he leaned forward to interrupt. I don't want to interfere in your parental rights with Bella, but I would like to ask that you not take away the camping tips. They mean so much to Esme. She enjoys all the girls so very much and sees Bella as part of the family now, one of her daughters. I would see it as a great favor if you'd let Bella continue to accompany us. It's one of the few things that distract Esme from the fact that we cannot have children of our own. It means so much to her. Carlisle pulled out the big guns. He was now playing dirty, and I was completely surprised. But I didn't say a thing. This was now between Charlie and Carlisle, and I trusted Carlisle to get done what needed to be done. My father was sitting on the edge of his chair with his elbows rested on his knees, and after a moment of looking at Carlisle, his head dropped into his hands. This was so stressing for my father. I hated having to do this to him, but the camping trips could not stop. I couldn't be out in public on sunny days. After several long minutes, Charlie finally lifted his head and sad eyes looked back at me. This was the face of the man who had rocked me as a baby, held me when I cried, and put up with years of whining about his home, to the point when he'd go anywhere I asked to spend even a few weeks of the summer with me. I looked back at him steadily. There was so much that we both wanted to say right now, but neither of us knew just how to do it. The silence grew, awkward and expansive, until my father cleared his throat and looked down again at his hands that had moved to be clasped in front of him. Bella, he said after what seemed like forever, you're still so young for all of this. I'm not sure you know what you're getting into. I do know, Dad. I tried to soothe him. Edward and I aren't in a big hurry to get married. I'm not so eager to move out. I just moved here. Maybe it would help if you thought of it as a promise ring instead of an engagement ring. Charlie's eyes went to my left hand that was clasped so gently in Edward's fingers, and his eyes widened in surprise. Let me see this ring, Bells, he said softly. I got up and walked over, offering my left hand to him. Edward sat forward on the couch, watching carefully. Charlie took my hand in his, peering down at the ring, and he turned my hand around this way and that to see each side. He dropped it after a moment and sighed as I returned to my spot on the couch. That's really unusual, Charlie finally said. It's been in my family since the late 1800s, Edward admitted quietly. It would not be prudent for him to admit that it had been his mother's. It was safer to give it a more vague history, but I knew it meant more to him than just the years he'd held on to it. Only one other woman had worn this ring. The fact that he wanted it on my finger spoke of the depth that he felt for me. There really was not, and would never be anyone else, for either of us. So, all those stones, it's real? Charlie choked this out, and I wasn't surprised since it had been my initial reaction too. Of course. Edward's tone was almost insulted. I would never give Bella costume jewelry, especially not for something so important. I have had to tell her, and I will repeat it again for you, Chief Swan. Bella is the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. I love her so completely that my life is empty without her. Charlie watched Edward with dark eyes. I knew he was taken in the protective posture, as Edward had taken my hand back to cover it with his own. I knew he noticed the way that Edward turned toward me as I sat beside him. The way he was ready to jump up to take care of anything that was needed. Charlie observed the tone, the pitch, and the words that Edward spoke. I knew Charlie viewed Edward as a cop would look at a suspect, assessing honesty, depth, feeling, all the things that would tell Charlie if he could trust Edward with his only daughter. I knew how my father's mind worked, and I could nearly see each thought as it passed through his mind. It wasn't as clear as Edward's mind reading, but I knew my father well after these months of living with him. I have no idea what Charlie decided, but he turned to look at me again, his eyes still sad, and he just nodded. "I can't live your life for you, Bells," he said quietly. "But I do want you to be careful. I don't want you making the same mistakes that your mother and I made." "I'm not, Dad. Mom's given her blessing. You know, she freaked out much less than you did." I wanted to remind him that, if there was a bad guy in this, he could blame it on Renee, who had given in almost immediately. Suddenly, Charlie stiffened and he shot a suspicious look at Edward and then back at me. "Bella, you don't have to get married, do you?" Charlie demanded, with a suddenness that almost startled me. I could not help it. I burst into laughter. Children were not ever in my future. I was unchangeable now, forever 17. "No, Dad, I'm not pregnant. Edward and we're not." I trailed off, not wanting to talk about this, especially in front of Carlisle and Edward. Charlie seemed surprised at that. I think he really thought Edward and I were trying to get away with as much as any normal pair of teenagers would. Honestly, if it were just me, he might be right, but Edward was so careful with our relationship, trying to ensure that he was doing everything just right. Edward wasn't only trying to take care of me with whatever I needed in this life, but also when it came time for me to meet God, he wanted to ensure that we hadn't done anything together that would keep me from heaven. I also knew that he didn't think there was anything he could do that would gain him entry, but I knew better. If there was a God passing judgment on us all, Edward was as likely to get into heaven as I was. Edward planned for eternity, and not just in the sense that as vampires we really might live forever. It meant a lot to me that I meant so much to him. Glancing back at Carlisle again, Charlie shrugged. "Fine, camping with Esme, but your time with Edward is seriously restricted, Bells. You have a real curfew now. You come straight home after school, and all guests are out of the house at 9 o'clock. He was laying down the law as he saw it, and I tried to look serious as he detailed his conditions. I knew this was not going to change our habits and lives much, but kept my mouth shut. If this made him happy, I'd put up with it for a few weeks, maybe a month or two. I wasn't sure how long he intended on keeping me grounded. "All right, Dad," I agreed quietly, trying to look reluctant but accepting. Charlie then looked over at Carlisle as he avoided looking at Edward. I could see that, no matter what I said, he was going to be angry at Edward for a long time. "Thank you for bringing her home safe," Charlie said to Carlisle. It was obvious that he didn't give any credit for this to Edward. Carlisle just nodded in agreement and rose to his feet, gesturing with his hand to Edward that it was time to go. Edward was expecting this, however, and he rose to his feet to follow his father to the door. I walked with them to see them out, with Charlie was right behind me to supervise. I wasn't going to let him go without even a hug, though I kept it brief and politely closed the door behind them as they left. It was always hard on me to watch Edward leave, but I knew I'd find him up in my room after Charlie went to sleep. I was still technically being babysat, and Edward wouldn't allow me to be without protection with werewolves around. After closing the door, I turned back to look at my father leaning on the inside of the front door. "Dad, I'm really sorry. I did want him to know that I did feel badly about what had happened. He would always think I was just being an impulsive, moody teenager when I'd done it to save his life. I still felt sorry about causing him worry and pain. However, you can show me that by not running off anymore, Bella. This is the second time now." His voice sounded a little strangled, and it made me feel even more horrible than I already felt. Neither time had been my fault, but I could never reveal that to him, which meant that I had to accept the punishments I was going to get as a result of the stories I'd had to tell. "I know, Dad. I think Edward is a steadying influence, though. He's so much more mature than other boys our age, and he means everything to me. I didn't think it would work, but I did have to try to get him to accept Edward in my life." Charlie just grunted, and then gestured upstairs, pointing his thumb up behind him toward my room. "Go on and make sure that you've got all your homework done before school starts again, on Monday." I nodded, though I was near the top of my class in almost everything. Edward and Alice were really my only rivals. I tried to look as though I were dragging my feet as I headed up the stairs and closed my bedroom door behind me. My homework was already done. It was one of the things I had used to help pass the time when we'd just been sitting and waiting in Phoenix. I still spread everything out on the table, leaving a pile of completed items that my father could review if he wanted. I knew he wouldn't, but it would make him feel better just to see it sitting there. I climbed on my bed into my comfy spot and looked up as the window slid open, silently. Edward climbed inside and then closed it behind him, every movement furtive and silent. He slid onto the bed beside me into his comfy spot, and I cuddled into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "I hate doing that to him," I said softly. That had been a high-stress situation for everyone, and Edward holding me like this was calming. "He'll forgive you, Bella. He's just worried that if he goes too easy on you, like your mother did, that you aren't going to learn from what he sees as mistakes. He thinks you'll think it's acceptable to just take off and you'll do it again and again," Edward told me softly right into my ear. "I will if I have to, not because it's something I enjoy." Next time something like this happens, Edward, we're telling him that Esme has this fabulous place she wants to take me camping, that is in Timbuktu or something. I tilted my head up to smile at him. That way I'm leaving legitimately, not running away. He laughed softly at that and tightened his arms around me. I couldn't quite relax completely in my father's house. I still battled myself constantly not to bite him. But here, in Edward's arms, it was as good as it got. "Do you think something like this is going to happen again?" he asked suddenly. I shrugged. With my luck, anything is possible. We fell into silence again, and my mind went over the last few months. I was amazed at the things that I had experienced, seen, and done. Everything in my life had changed. I had changed. My future held things that I never would have expected, though. If I had known Edward was out there waiting for me, I'd have accepted them eagerly. I wondered as I sat within my beloved's arms what the future would bring. Alice knew, to a degree, but some things she didn't think were appropriate to share. I think she feared it would change the future that we all wanted if she said too much. I didn't worry about that at this moment, however. I knew a part of what my future would be. It would be forever, with Edward. When I had that to look forward to, it didn't matter what happened or where we were, or even what we did, as long as we were together where I always wanted to be. "Thank you, fate," I said too softly for even Edward to hear, and I smiled against his shoulder.